The room smells of floor wax and old paper. Someone years ago chose a shade of green for the walls that was probably called something like sage mist or doctor's comfort, and the paint has since faded into a colour without a name. There are magazines on a low table, women's magazines mostly. The covers feature women in cotton blouses and A-line skirts, smiling the particular smile of someone who has recently been told she's doing everything correctly. The year is 1958. The year is 1962. The year is 1967. The waiting room is always the same room. You're sitting in a chair with vinyl upholstery. The chair makes a small sound when you shift your weight. Across from you, a woman in a blue coat studies her own hands. Next to her, a woman in a yellow cardigan stares at a point on the wall, slightly above the magazine rack, thinking about something she has not yet found words for. The receptionist behind the frosted glass is writing something down. The scratch of her pen is the only sound that moves through the room with any purpose. Somewhere beyond the inner door, in a room you cannot see, a man with a stethoscope around his neck is reviewing a chart. He has a good reputation in this neighbourhood. His patients trust him. His patients are, in the main, women. Wives, mothers, women who have come in with a concern they've had trouble naming, a restlessness, a fatigue, a sense that the body is not cooperating with the life it has been assigned. He's about to help them. He believes this. Everyone in this building believes this. On the counter near the door, between a small brass lamp and a pot of silk flowers, there is a display of amber bottles. They are neat and orderly, the labels facing forward. The pharmacist 2 streets over has the same display. Your neighbour's medicine cabinet has 4 of those bottles, and she's mentioned them twice this week, once at the school gate and once over the back fence while collecting laundry. She looks very well, you have noticed. She has lost 12 pounds since March. This is a story about those bottles, about the women who carried them home in their handbags, who took them with their morning coffee, who noticed something happening inside themselves and did not always have the language to describe it. It is a story that begins in a doctor's office in 1958 and does not end, not exactly, into 2026, though the bottles have changed shape and the labels have changed language, and the waiting room chairs are now upholstered in something that does not make a sound when you shift your weight. The narrator is not alarmed. She has known this story long enough that she has made peace with most of it. She's simply here, in the particular quiet of a waiting room, in the particular light of an afternoon that understood nothing about what it was doing. Settle in. There is no hurry. If you enjoy listening to sleep stories like this, subscribe. I post stories like this weekly. Before the bottles, there was the body. And before the body, before the particular kind of attention that post-war American culture turned on the female body, there was a war, and then the abrupt, disorienting fact of peace. In 1945, the men came home. This is the story everyone knows. What the story is somewhat quieter about is what the women were expected to do with themselves once they did. 4 years of factory work, of wages, of a certain productive independence. And then the men came home and the factories wanted their shifts back, and the culture wanted its story back. The story where women were domestic and ornamental and grateful, not competent and tiredness thin in work clothes. The transition was not gentle. It was not supposed to be visible. It was dressed, with some ingenuity in the language of desire and romance and the natural order of things. Rosie the Riveter folded her bandana and put on a shirtwaist dress, and was told that what she had always really wanted was a kitchen with modern appliances and a husband who came home at 6. And many women wanted exactly that. This is worth saying. The post-war suburb was not a prison for everyone who lived in it. There were women who found genuine pleasure in the structure of domestic life, in the raising of children, in the quiet productivity of a household run well. The problem was not that some women wanted this. The problem was that all women were told they wanted it, and that wanting anything else was a sign of psychological disorder. The American Psychiatric Association in 1952 published its first diagnostic and statistical manual of mental disorders, and it was a document that would have made a certain kind of reading uncomfortable if anyone had thought to hold it up against the magazines on that waiting room table. Unhappiness in women was medicalized. Restlessness was a symptom. Dissatisfaction with the life one had been assigned was diagnosable. Into this atmosphere, and it was an atmosphere, something you breathed rather than noticed, came a new set of ideas about the body, about what a woman's body should look like in peacetime, about what thinness meant. This is where the story begins to narrow toward those amber bottles. But the narrowing takes time, and the route goes through fashion magazines and Hollywood studios and a particular kind of cultural anxiety that, once you see it, you cannot quite unsee. The post-war ideal female body was thin, not the thin of wartime scarcity. That was desperation, a failure of prosperity. This was a different kind of thin, curated thin, effortful thin, thin as a visible sign of self-discipline, of femininity held to a precise and daily standard. Christian Dior's new look in 1947, that famous cinched waist, that billowing skirt, required a specific silhouette, and the silhouette required work, and the work required a body that did not eat too much, did not take up too much space, did not in any visible way exceed its own outline. The fashion magazines of the late 1940s and 1950s treated the female body as a project, and they were not quiet about it. Diet advice appeared alongside recipes. Exercise regimens sat next to patterns for house dresses. The ideal weight for a woman of 5 feet 4 inches was listed in charts with the authority of a tax schedule. Anything above this number was a deviation. A deviation from what? From the ideal. And the ideal, it turned out, was not a medical determination. It was an aesthetic one, dressed in the language of health. The word health is doing a great deal of work in the 1950s. It is doing the work that discipline used to do and that virtue did before that. A healthy woman is a thin woman, is a good woman, is a woman who has her appetites under control. The appetite for food stands in, somewhat uselessly, for all the other appetites that it was impolite to mention. A woman who ate correctly was, the culture suggested, a woman who was in all other respects as she should be. Doctors absorbed this. They were in most cases men who had grown up in the same culture, read the same magazines, internalized the same standards. When a patient came in with what she described as a weight concern, they did not typically ask who had decided her weight was a concern, or what standard she was measuring herself against, or whether the standard was worth measuring against at all. They listened. They weighed her. They noted the number on the chart. And increasingly, across the early 1950s, they reached for a prescription pad. The drug they were reaching for was not new. Amphetamine had been synthesized in 1887 by a Romanian chemist named Lazar Edeleanu, and then largely forgotten for 40 years, until 1929, when the American chemist Gordon Alice rediscovered and refined it, and noticed that it made him feel, as he recorded in his lab notebook, a rather warm sensation over the head, then a gradual quieting of the respiratory rhythm, and a moderate quickening of the pulse. Not exactly a ringing endorsement, but the pharmaceutical industry was paying attention. Smith, Kline and French began marketing amphetamine in 1932 as Benzedrine, an over-the-counter inhaler for nasal congestion. Benzedrine inhalers were available in any pharmacy without a prescription, and they became, with some speed, something other than a treatment for blocked noses. Students discovered that breaking open the inhaler and swallowing the medicated strip produced a sustained wakefulness that was useful for examinations. Soldiers discovered that it pushed back exhaustion. Truck drivers discovered it on long overnight hauls. Writers discovered it on deadline. The military issued amphetamines to Allied servicemen during the Second World War, 72 million tablets to British forces alone by some estimates. American and German soldiers also received them, a fact that makes the post-war amphetamine era feel somewhat less surprising in retrospect. The men who came home had in many cases some familiarity with what amphetamines could do. But this is not the story of soldiers. It is the story of women in waiting rooms. And the route from the military to the medicine cabinet runs through a particular moment in pharmaceutical marketing history, when the industry discovered that a drug that suppressed appetite was a drug that could be sold to a culture that had just decided appetite suppression was the most important thing a woman could demonstrate. By 1947, Dexedrine, dextroamphetamine, the refined right-handed isomer of the amphetamine molecule, had been approved for use in treating obesity. The approval required evidence of efficacy, and the evidence existed. Amphetamines did suppress appetite, at least in the short term. They also produced a sense of energy and well-being that had its own appeal, especially to women who were spending their days in houses that were never quite clean enough, raising children who were never quite quiet enough, managing the domestic apparatus of post-war prosperity with a thoroughness that left them, by evening, with a particular quality of exhaustion that did not have a polite name. The pharmaceutical companies understood this. The detail men, the sales representatives who called on doctors' offices with samples and brochures, and the patient, collegial manner of men who understand that the doctor is always right, even when he is agreeing with them, understood it explicitly. The brochures were designed for doctors, but they were designed to describe patients that both the doctor and the detail man could picture clearly. Overweight housewife, they said, or words to that effect. Lacking energy. Difficulty maintaining the recommended weight. Candidate for Dexedrine. The doctor in the waiting room looked at his patient. He looked at the chart. He weighed her against the standard the culture had established, the standard the pharmaceutical brochure had helpfully confirmed. He reached for his prescription pad. And across the country, in waiting rooms exactly like this one, with the same green paint and the same old magazines and the same quiet scratch of pen on paper, millions of women began to carry those amber bottles home. The year is 1953, the year is 1957, the year is 1961. The waiting room is always the same room, and the hand that accepts the amber bottle is always reaching for something it has been told it needs. The bottles are very small. They fit easily in a handbag between the compact and the grocery list. They make almost no sound when they move. Outside, the afternoon light falls on the parking lot the way afternoon light falls on parking lots in the 1950s. Flat and honest and without particular comment. Somewhere in the distance a child is calling for someone. The sound doesn't carry. There is an art to selling something that people have not yet been told they want. The pharmaceutical industry in the early 1950s had something to sell. A drug that had been through the war and come back with a reputation. A drug that had genuine and measurable effects. A drug that could do several things at once. And it had an audience whose desires it had been studying for some years. The work of bringing these two things together was a matter of language, of framing, of finding the right words for a thing the culture was already half inclined to believe. The right words turned out to be quite close to the surface. Diet pills was a phrase that came with associations, with desperation, with weakness, with the specific admission that one had failed at the simplest of self-management tasks. The women of the 1950s were not, in the main, interested in being seen as desperate or weak. They were interested in being seen as competent, graceful, in possession of themselves. The pharmaceutical industry knew this. The detail men who visited doctors' offices with their brochures and their samples knew this. So the language shifted. Amphetamines prescribed for weight management were not diet pills. They were medication for metabolic insufficiency. They were support for the treatment of obesity, a medical condition with a medical name and a medical solution. The woman who took them was not failing at self-control. She was receiving treatment for a physiological problem, the way you receive treatment for a thyroid condition, or a vitamin deficiency. The prescription was proof that the problem was real. The prescription was, in a way, absolution. The marketing materials were subtle about this, and subtlety was the point. A brochure from Smith, Klein and French in 1956 describes the typical Dexedrine candidate as a woman who is not merely overweight, but who has struggled with her weight despite sincere effort, whose motivation to lose weight is present and genuine, who simply requires pharmacological assistance to achieve what her own willpower has not managed to deliver. The language treats willpower as a real but limited resource, and Dexedrine as the thing that makes the limited resource go further. It is a very comfortable story. It costs the patient nothing in self-reproach. By the mid-1950s, the pharmaceutical companies had also discovered something useful about the secondary effects of amphetamine. The appetite suppression was the primary selling point, the reason the prescriptions were written. But appetite suppression was not the only thing happening. Women who took Dexedrine also reported an increase in energy, a clarity of purpose, an ability to manage the domestic tasks they had previously found overwhelming, the cleaning, the cooking, the management of children, the maintenance of a house that the culture required to be presentable at all times. This was not nothing. This was, in the context of a life that demanded constant physical and emotional labour from women who were told the labour should feel natural and effortless, genuinely valuable. Some of the marketing materials began to reference this, carefully with the precision of people who understood that they were walking near a line they should not cross publicly. A woman on Dexedrine was more energetic, more productive, more capable of meeting the demands of her household. She was, the subtext suggested, better at being a woman, not just thinner, better. The word elegant appeared in a 1958 advertisement in a medical journal. The advertisement was aimed at doctors, not at patients. Advertising directly to patients was not yet standard practice, but the word elegant described what the company understood the patient to want. The patient wanted to be elegant. Thinness was part of elegance. Energy was part of elegance. The composure to manage a household without visible strain was part of elegance. Dexedrine could help with all of these things, and the word elegant held them all together in a way that felt aspirational rather than medical. This was the genius of the framing, and it was deliberate. The pharmaceutical industry had learned from the patent medicine era, from the Benzedrine inhaler's accidental transformation, from nasal decongestant to stimulant of choice for students and jazz musicians and anyone who needed to push through the night. Direct appeals to intoxication, to euphoria, to the blunter pleasures of speed were legally and culturally problematic. But appeals to femininity, to grace, to the visible achievement of domestic competence, these were unimpeachable. You were not taking a stimulant. You were becoming the woman you were meant to be. The detail men who visited doctors' offices in the late 1950s were trained in this language. They were, as a class, personable and confident and well-dressed, in a way that conveyed not glamour but trustworthiness. They brought samples, they brought statistics, they brought studies, and there were studies, many of them, published in respectable medical journals with the imprimatur of institutions whose names carried weight. The studies generally showed that amphetamines produced meaningful short-term weight loss, which was true. They were somewhat less forthcoming about what happened after the short term, or about what happened when the prescription was discontinued. The doctors listened. The doctors were, in most cases, busy men with full waiting rooms and a cultural mandate to help their patients with the concerns their patients brought to them. The concerns that women brought to them, with increasing frequency through the late 1950s and into the 1960s, included weight. The doctors had something to offer for this concern. They offered it. By 1960, the American Medical Association had approved Dexedrine for use in the treatment of obesity. The approval was a formal recognition of what was already happening in doctors' offices across the country. An estimated 8 million American women were taking some form of amphetamine prescribed by their own physicians. The number is difficult to verify with precision. Pharmaceutical records were not kept in ways that make retrospective counting easy, but multiple sources from the period converge on figures in this range, and the pharmaceutical industry's own internal projections, where they have survived, suggest similar numbers. 8 million, it is a number that requires a moment. To put it another way, in 1960, roughly 1 in 13 American women was taking prescription amphetamines. In the suburban neighborhoods where the drug was most heavily marketed, middle class, predominantly white, the neighborhoods of the women's magazines and the television advertisements and the new ranch houses with the 2-car garages, the penetration was considerably higher. The bottles on the pharmacist's shelves were amber, squat, child-proof in the sense of being difficult to open quickly. The tablets inside were small and sometimes orange, which was a colour associated in the pharmaceutical industry of that era with stimulation and alertness, a piece of visual coding so embedded in the culture that it persists in various forms to this day. Some women took 1 tablet in the morning, some took 2. Some found themselves, by the early months of the prescription, taking 3 because 1 tablet was no longer producing the effect it had produced at the beginning, and the effect was useful, and the alternative was not taking the tablet, which had its own quality that was harder to describe. The bottles were very easy to refill. The doctor's receptionist knew you. She knew your name and your chart number and the name of your husband and perhaps the names of your children. She wrote your refill in the appointment book, with the same pen she used for everything else. There was nothing remarkable about it. It was medicine. You were taking it for a medical reason. The doctor had prescribed it. The amber bottles moved through the 1950s and into the 1960s with the quiet inevitability of something that has found its niche. They were in handbags and medicine cabinets and kitchen drawers, between the rubber bands and the stray birthday candles and the small accumulated evidence of domestic life. They were discussed at bridge clubs and over the telephone in the late morning, with the particular candour that women of this era reserved for conversations held when the children were at school and the husband was at work. "Have you tried the little orange pills?" one woman asked another. in a sentence that was repeated in various forms across the country throughout the late 1950s, and the answer was very often yes, or I've been thinking about it, or my doctor mentioned them last month. The language was casual because the pills were medical. The pills were medical because the doctor had prescribed them. The doctor had prescribed them because the pharmaceutical company had told him they were safe and effective. The pharmaceutical company had told him this because the studies said so. The studies said so because the industry had funded most of them. This is a loop that was not visible from inside it. From inside it, the amber bottle was simply medicine. From inside it, the morning tablet was simply part of the routine. The light in the kitchen in 1959 is yellow and warm, and falls through the window above the sink in a particular way, depending on the season. The coffee percolates, the children are being dressed for school, the amber bottle is on the counter by the radio, and the woman standing at the sink looking out at the backyard with its careful lawn and its clean washing line, reaches for it with the same movement she uses to reach for her vitamin C. There is nothing to notice about this movement. There is nothing alarming about the morning. The consultation took on average 11 minutes. This is not a guess. It is a figure that appears in studies of primary care practice in the United States in the 1950s and 1960s, the first era when researchers began tracking such things with any rigour. 11 minutes, the time it takes to soft boil an egg, or to read through the letter you have been putting off answering, or to have a conversation that would significantly alter the course of the next decade of your life. The woman sat across from the doctor. Between them was a desk of reasonable size with a green leather blotter and a telephone, and a small framed photograph of children at a lake. The doctor had notes from the last visit. He had a stethoscope around his neck, the way a certain kind of man has a pen behind his ear, not because he needs it right now, but because it belongs to him, because it tells you something about who he is. "How are you feeling?" he asked, or some version of this. The question was an opening, not an inquiry. She had prepared what she wanted to say, the way women of this era generally prepared what they wanted to say before entering a room where someone with more formal authority was waiting to hear it. She had tried to be precise. She had the numbers, her weight in the morning, her weight last month, the dress size that no longer fit. She had the feeling, which was harder to put precisely, a heaviness, a lack of the energy she felt she should have, a sense that the body was not cooperating with the plan she had for it. The doctor listened. In the 11 minutes available to him, listening was the most efficient tool he had. He was good at the efficient deployment of attention. He asked about sleep, about appetite, though the word appetite in this context was almost entirely about food and calories and the management thereof, not about the full range of things a woman's life might contain. He made notes. He checked her weight against the chart. He did the mental arithmetic that placed her above or below the line that the culture had drawn, and that the medical profession had in its way endorsed. The numbers told him what they told him. He reached for the prescription pad. What he said next varied, of course, from doctor to doctor, from practice to practice, from the beginning to the end of this era. But the broad outlines were consistent. There is a medication, he said, or words very close to this. It is very effective for cases like yours. It will help with the appetite. That was usually how he phrased it. Help with the appetite, as though the appetite were a difficult guest you were learning to manage. And many patients find they have more energy as well. You should come back in 6 weeks. He handed her the prescription. What she received was a piece of paper with his handwriting on it, which would be exchanged at the pharmacy for an amber bottle, which would cost a few dollars, which was not nothing but was not prohibitive, which would sit in her kitchen or her bathroom or her handbag and become part of the machinery of the day. The transaction was complete. The 11 minutes were up. What was not said in those 11 minutes is its own kind of history. Amphetamines were known by 1955, known in the medical literature, known in pharmacological research, known in the quiet internal memos of pharmaceutical companies, to produce tolerance. Tolerance meant that the dose which produced a given effect on day 1 would produce a lesser effect on day 30, and a lesser effect still on day 90. The effect could be restored by increasing the dose. Increasing the dose was not discussed in the 11-minute consultation, at least not proactively. It was discovered by the patient after the first refill. Dependence was also known. The word dependence appeared in the medical literature with increasing frequency through the mid-1950s. Physical dependence, the kind where the body reorganizes itself around the presence of a drug and then responds badly to its absence, was documented. Case reports described it. Review articles discussed it. The pharmaceutical company's own research acknowledged it, in language carefully chosen to minimize alarm. The detail man did not lead with this information when he called on the doctor's office. Withdrawal was rarely discussed with patients at the time of prescribing. Withdrawal from amphetamines is not dramatic in the way that withdrawal from alcohol or opiates can be. There are no seizures, no life-threatening crises, no emergency room presentations with features that announce themselves clearly. What withdrawal from amphetamines looked like in a suburban housewife in 1960 was something quieter, a profound fatigue, a depression that settled in like weather, a heaviness of mood that was, from the outside, indistinguishable from the unhappiness she had come to the doctor about in the first place. The symmetry of this is almost elegant. The symptom and the withdrawal effect were the same thing, which meant that withdrawal presented itself and was often interpreted as evidence that the medication was necessary. You felt terrible without it. This proved it was working. This was not quite the same thing as knowing that it was working, but it felt like it, and in the 11-minute consultation, feeling was the primary available evidence. Some doctors knew more of this than others. Some doctors had read the literature more carefully, or had longer memories of the Benzedrine inhaler era, or had begun to notice something in their patient population that gave them pause. These doctors sometimes declined to prescribe or prescribed with restrictions, or asked more questions than the 11 minutes strictly required. They are documented in the record as exceptions. The more common figure is the doctor who prescribed in good faith, in the genuine belief that the medication was appropriate, that the risk-benefit calculation favoured intervention, that the patient's concern was legitimate, and the treatment was established. He was a man of his time, this doctor. He had trained in institutions that taught him what the institutions had been taught, which was a version of the industry's own preferred story. He wanted to help. He believed he was helping. Across the hall from his consulting room, in the waiting room, the women on the vinyl chairs were reading the magazines with their particular smiling covers, and one of them had a small bottle in her handbag already, and one of them was about to receive one, and one of them had just refilled hers and was thinking about whether she should mention to the doctor that she'd been taking 3 instead of 2, and she had decided before she came in that she would not mention this, because she was not sure how he would respond, and the 3 were working, and she did not want to have a conversation about stopping. She had things to do when she got home. The receptionist called her name. She stood. She smoothed her skirt. She walked through the door. The doctor's office smelled of antiseptic and old upholstery and something floral that came from the small spray bottle the receptionist kept on her desk. It was not unpleasant. It was the smell of authority, of competence, of the place where your concerns became manageable. It was the smell of help. 11 minutes. She shook the doctor's hand at the end, the way one shook hands in 1960. Formally, briefly, the gesture of a transaction completed to both parties' satisfaction. She took the prescription. She thanked him. She walked back through the waiting room, past the women on the chairs, out through the door and into the afternoon. The afternoon was bright and smelled of cut grass and car exhaust. The pharmacy was 2 blocks away. She had a list of other things she needed to pick up while she was there. The pharmacist knew her by name. This was the kind of neighbourhood where the pharmacist knew you by name and knew your husband's name and knew what you were usually picking up, and the knowing was a form of care that was also a form of surveillance, though no one would have used that word in 1960, and the surveillance was not malign. It was simply the way that a small professional community held the health of its customers in the loose net of familiarity and routine. He filled the prescription while she browsed the cosmetics aisle. He had the bottle ready when she came to the counter, and he put it in a small white bag with her name written on the outside in his clean pharmacist's handwriting. He mentioned the dosage, which she already knew, and the instruction not to take it too late in the day, which she had already learned from experience. He said call if you have any questions, which was what he said to everyone, and she said thank you, which was what everyone said. She put the bag in her handbag beside the other purchases and walked out into the afternoon. The sidewalk was warm under her shoes. The air had the particular quality of a suburban afternoon in late spring. The smell of someone's lawn being cut, the sound of children a street over, the low hum of the world going about its ordinary business without particular urgency. This was 1960. This was also 1963 and 1967, and with diminishing frequency, 1971. The afternoon and the pharmacy and the small white bag and the name written in clean handwriting, these were the recurring elements of a ritual that had become as unremarkable as picking up the dry cleaning or stopping for milk. The prescription was part of the infrastructure of the day. It was not remarkable. It was simply medicine. The pharmacist watched her go. He picked up the next prescription from the pile. The scratch of his pen was the same scratch as the doctor's pen, the scratch of authority confirming care, the sound of the system doing what the system does. The tablet is small and salmon-coloured and dissolves on the tongue for just a moment before you swallow it with the last third of your morning coffee. The coffee has been cooling while you got the children's lunches into their boxes, while you found the permission slip that was due last Friday, while you wrote the grocery list in your careful handwriting on the notepad by the telephone. The kitchen smells of toast and dish soap and the faint metallic note of the percolator. It is 8:17 in the morning. By 8:45 the children are on the school bus, the dishes are in the rack, and you are standing in the middle of the kitchen noticing that the quality of the morning has changed. It is not dramatic. It does not feel like a pharmaceutical effect, at least not in the way that word suggests, not like something imposed from outside. It feels rather like a fog lifting, like the morning has become slightly more itself. The light coming through the window is the same light, but it is more legible somehow, more available to be used. There is a list of things you need to do today, and instead of the dull weight the list usually carries, it presents itself as simply a series of tasks, ordered, achievable, waiting to be moved through. This is the part that was genuinely difficult to argue with, for the women who took it and for the doctors who prescribed it. The effect was real. It was not imagined. It was not a placebo operating on wishful thinking. Dexedrine produced, in most people who took it, a measurable increase in what the psychologists of the era called drive, the motivated engagement with tasks, the willingness to begin and continue and complete. In women whose daily lives consisted largely of tasks that had no natural beginning or end, that accumulated and receded and accumulated again without the satisfaction of completion, this was not nothing. You clean the bathroom, which you do in a particular order, the order you have always done it in since you moved into this house, tile by tile, fixture by fixture. The smell of the cleaning powder is sharp and clean. Your hands move through the routine with the pleasant efficiency of a machine that has been properly calibrated. You finish. You move to the bedroom. The bed gets made with the crisp satisfaction of a thing done correctly. The pillows sit at the angle they are supposed to sit at. You step back and look at them for a moment. By 10 o'clock you have moved through half the list. You do not feel tired. This is the word that comes to you when you try to describe it to your neighbour on the phone that afternoon. Not tired. As though the absence of tiredness is itself the thing you want to name. As though the tiredness has been so constant for so long that its absence feels like a specific experience rather than simply a neutral state. Your neighbour understands this. She has been on Dexedrine for 3 months, slightly longer than you. She says she has lost 11 pounds. She says she forgot to eat lunch on Tuesday, which she says with a laugh that has a slightly complex quality, both proud and slightly wondering at herself. You say you had a few crackers at noon. This seems like enough. The idea of lunch, the preparation of it, the sitting down for it, the eating of it, seems elaborately unnecessary. Your stomach is quiet in a way that is unfamiliar and not unpleasant. The appetite suppression is the target of the prescription. It is also the mechanism that is easiest to overlook when you're inside the experience, because it does not present itself as suppression. It presents itself as the body simply not asking. The hunger signal that should be arriving around noon does not arrive, or arrives very faintly, like a radio station you can almost but not quite hear. You could attend to it if you tried, but you are in the middle of something, and the signal seems more like a distraction than an actual need. This continues. By midday, the house is clean, the grocery list has been amended, and you have written 2 letters you had been putting off for weeks. The writing went quickly. The sentences came in the order you wanted them to come. You reread them, and they seemed correct. You sealed the envelopes with a sense of completion that felt disproportionate to the task, and that disproportionate quality you noticed, and filed away without quite examining it. There is a study from 1963 conducted at a university hospital in the Midwest. that attempted to quantify the subjective experience of women taking prescription amphetamines for weight management. The researchers asked participants to describe how they felt. The words that appeared most frequently in the responses were capable, clear, on top of things, as though the fog had lifted. Some participants used the phrase finally, followed by a description of the task they had completed. Finally got the drawers sorted. Finally wrote back to my sister. Finally feel like I am managing. Managing? The word recurs. The women of the Dexedrine era were managing their houses, managing their families, managing their bodies, managing the gap between the domestic ideal and the domestic reality. And the amphetamine was a management tool, a piece of technology in the machinery of daily life, as ordinary and as purposeful as the new dishwasher, as the automatic washing machine, as the convenience foods that were appearing in grocery stores and promising to restore to women the time they had spent in the kitchen. Progress was offering them time. Dexedrine was offering them the energy to fill it. The afternoon has a different quality from the morning. By 2 o'clock, the forward momentum of the morning is still present, but has become something slightly more introspective. You're aware of a sharpness at the edges of your thoughts. The words on the page of the library book you try to read in the half hour before the school bus comes are very clear, but your attention moves through them quickly, does not settle, picks up another thought before the sentence is finished. You put the book down, you straighten the cushions on the sofa, which do not need straightening. By the time the children come home, you're ready for them. This is the phrase that comes to you, ready. You have the snacks out, the kitchen wiped down, the laundry folded. You are present in the way that a good mother, in the language of the era, is present, available, organised, not distracted by the weight of uncompleted tasks. The children come through the door with their noise and their school day, and you absorb them into the afternoon. Dinner is made and served and cleared. The husband comes home at 6. You have set the table. The casserole has been in the oven since 4:30. You eat, or rather you move food around your plate with reasonable art while he describes his day, while the children describe school, while the ordinary evening traffic of a household in 1960 moves through the kitchen. You are not hungry. This is fine. This is the point. After the children are in bed, after the kitchen is cleaned for the second time today, you sit in the living room with the television on at low volume and you feel, for the first time since morning, a drop. Not a crash. The literature will use the word crash later, when the language for this gets sharper. But a subsidence. The day, which was very full and very managed and very much under your control, recedes slightly. You are aware of a tiredness that has been waiting patiently in the background. You go to bed at 10:30. You lie in the dark and your mind, which has been moving at a certain pace all day, does not slow as quickly as you would like. There are thoughts about tomorrow, about the list you will need to write, about whether you need to call the dentist. The thoughts are not distressing. They are simply present, more present than they should be at this hour. You sleep eventually, not deeply, not dreamlessly, but you sleep. The amber bottle is on the bathroom counter. In the morning you will reach for it before your first cup of coffee, because this is the order of things now, because the day does not start the same way without it, because the fog that you did not notice before you started taking it has become, now, legible as fog, and the alternative, waking into it without the tablet, is something you have tried, on a day you ran out and couldn't get to the pharmacy, and the quality of that day was so different from this day that you are disinclined to repeat the experiment. You pull the blanket up. Your husband is already asleep. The house is quiet the way houses in 1960 are quiet, with the ticking of a clock, with the refrigerator's ambient hum, with the sound of a neighbourhood settling into the night. Tuesday is over, Wednesday will need you. The detail man arrived at the doctor's office on Tuesdays. He drove a company car, in this case a 1957 Chevrolet, in a shade the paint chart called surf green, which was one of those mid-century colours that managed to seem simultaneously cheerful and authoritative. He wore a grey suit. His shoes were polished. He carried a sample case with aluminum clasps. His name was something like Carter or Henderson or Marsh. He had been in pharmaceutical sales for 4 years, having come from an insurance background, which was considered good preparation. The skill was similar, the product was simply more personal. He had a good memory for names. He remembered from month to month which doctors were receptive to Dexedrine, which had concerns they liked to articulate before agreeing, which preferred their statistics in graph form. He had statistics in both formats. The pharmaceutical sales force in the late 1950s was one of the most sophisticated direct marketing operations in American business history. This is not an exaggeration. By 1960, the major pharmaceutical companies employed an estimated 20,000 detail men in the United States, calling on approximately 160,000 physicians on a regular rotation. The ratio was roughly one sales representative for every 8 doctors. In a busy suburban practice, the same detail man might appear 6 times a year, which was more frequent than some patients. The relationship between the detail man and the doctor was carefully managed by both parties. It was collegial, not quite a friendship, but not quite a commercial transaction either. It occupied a middle territory that the pharmaceutical companies had designed with some care. There were lunches, occasionally at the restaurant near the medical office park. There were educational dinners, which were common across the industry, and which combined a genuine medical presentation with food that was slightly better than the doctors ate at home. There were samples, always samples, which the companies understood to be one of the most powerful tools in the arsenal. The doctor who gave a patient a sample from a box in the supply closet had already prescribed the drug, in a sense, before he had written a word on the prescription pad. The samples for Dexedrine came in small bottles, like the prescription bottles, but with sample printed on the label, and with a form attached that the doctor was supposed to fill out reporting on the patient's response. The forms were not always returned, the samples were always accepted. The science that the detail man carried was real, in the way that science in commercial contexts is real, accurate as far as it went, and careful about how far it went. The clinical trials that supported amphetamine prescribing for obesity in the 1950s were legitimate studies, published in legitimate journals, with legitimate methodology. They showed what they showed, that patients taking amphetamines lost more weight over 12 weeks than patients taking placebo. This was true. It was also true that the studies rarely extended beyond 12 weeks, and that the industry had reasons for not extending them, and that the behavior of the drug at 16 weeks or 24 weeks or 3 years was not what was being presented to the doctors. The pharmaceutical industry funded the majority of clinical research on its own products in this era. This was not yet a concern that occupied much public attention. The structure of research funding, who paid for the studies, who had an interest in their outcomes, who controlled the decision of whether to publish a result or leave it in the file drawer, was not yet the subject of the scrutiny that it would later receive. The doctors who read the journals read the studies that were published. What was not published was not something they could see. There is a document preserved in the archive of what was once Smith, Kline and French, and is now part of a different pharmaceutical entity entirely, that dates from 1954 and concerns the internal review of weight management data for Dexedrine. The document is in good condition. The language is precise. What it describes, in the careful prose of a corporate internal memo, is a pattern that the company's own researchers had identified, that the weight loss produced by amphetamines in the early weeks of treatment was not sustained past the 6-month mark, and that patients who had been on the drug for 6 months showed weight loss figures not significantly different from patients who had stopped taking it 3 months earlier. The memo notes this. It recommends further study. It does not recommend changes to the marketing materials. The marketing materials continue to present amphetamines as an effective treatment for obesity, with the word effective defined in a way that covered the first 12 weeks and remained silent on everything after. This is how industry science worked in the 1950s. It was not unique to amphetamines, and it was not unique to this company. It was a structural feature of an industry that was simultaneously the primary funder of research on its own products, the primary publisher of that research through medical journal advertising budgets that were not incidental to editorial decisions, and the primary educator of the physicians who prescribed the products, through the detail, men, and the educational dinners and the free samples and the journals, whose pages were thick with pharmaceutical advertising. The doctors were not fools. The better ones read the studies with some skepticism, asked questions about methodology, compared notes with colleagues whose patients were developing patterns worth noticing. But they were operating in an information environment that had been designed, at significant expense and with considerable sophistication, to produce a particular understanding of the available evidence. The information environment said, "This drug works. It is safe. The concerns are manageable. Your patients will benefit." The detail man with the surf green Chevrolet and the grey suit and the aluminum sample case would have resisted the word manipulation. He would have called it education. He would have said correctly that he presented factual information about a legitimate pharmaceutical product approved by the Food and Drug Administration, that he answered questions honestly, that he left doctors free to make their own decisions. All of this was true. The information he presented was factual. The presentation was a frame, and the frame was built with care, but the facts inside it were real. The Food and Drug Administration in the 1950s was a different organisation from what it would later become. The 1938 Federal Food, Drug and Cosmetic Act had required that drugs be proven safe before marketing, a requirement that had been added with some urgency after a sulfanilamide elixir made with a solvent analogous to antifreeze had killed more than 100 people in 1937. Safety was required. Efficacy, whether the drug actually worked for its stated purpose, was not yet a regulatory requirement. That would come with the Kefauver-Harris Amendment in 1962, which was itself the consequence of a near catastrophe that we will come to. In the meantime, the amber bottles moved through the decade. The detail men made their rounds, the doctors wrote their prescriptions. The study showed 12 weeks of encouraging data. The women in the waiting rooms went home with their prescriptions, and their neighbours asked how they were feeling, and they said, in many cases for the first year or two, "Better, actually, I do feel better. I feel more myself somehow," which was a phrase that the culture would have found encouraging, and the pharmaceutical industry would have found deeply satisfying. More herself, as though the self she had been before the prescription was a compromised version, a draft, as though the drug was not adding anything foreign to her experience, but restoring something that had been missing. This is a particular kind of pharmaceutical alchemy. The drug that presents itself not as an intervention, but as a correction, not as something new, but as something returned. It was, it should be noted, not a marketing strategy invented for Dexedrine. It would not end with Dexedrine either. The desire to frame pharmaceutical intervention as restoration, as the recovery of the self one was always supposed to be, is a thread that runs through the history of drugs prescribed to women across the 20th century and into the 21st. The thread is not hard to follow. It starts in this room, with this detail man, with this sample case and its aluminum clasps. He was picking up his case now, shaking the doctor's hand, saying he would be back next month. The doctor was already turning to look at the next patient's chart. Outside, the surf green Chevrolet waited in the parking lot, next to the cars of the patients, next to the bicycles chained to the rack by the door. The afternoon moved on. There were women who noticed something was wrong, not the dramatic ones, not the women who turned up in emergency rooms or appeared in newspaper stories or became cautionary examples in medical case files. Those women exist in the record, and their stories have their own weight, but they are not quite the story here. The story here is quieter. It is the story of ordinary noticing, of the accumulation, slow and without drama, of small observations that did not add up to a crisis, but added up to something. Unease, a question held internally, a conversation with a neighbour that circled around a thing without quite landing on it. A woman in a suburb outside Cincinnati, her name does not appear in any record that has survived, but she appears in a 1964 study of amphetamine use conducted by a researcher at Ohio State University, and she's identified only by the initial M. Described the experience as follows: "I started to feel that I was performing a role rather than living. The house was very clean, I was very productive, but I could not tell you what I had thought about on any given Tuesday. The thoughts were very quick and they did not seem to be my thoughts exactly." She had been taking Dexedrine for 2 years at the time of this interview. She did not describe herself as addicted. She described herself as uncertain. The uncertainty was a specific kind of uncertainty, not doubt about whether the drug was working. It was clearly working, in the sense that the scale showed the number the doctor wanted to see, and the house was demonstrably clean, and the children were managed. The uncertainty was about what working meant, whether the performance of competence was the same as competence, whether the energy she felt was a restoration of something she had lacked, or the installation of something artificial, whether the self who moved efficiently through the day was her actual self or a version of herself that the drug had produced, and what the difference between these two things was, and whether the difference mattered. These were not simple questions, and the Dexedrine era did not give women good tools for answering them. The language available was the language of medicine, the doctor's language, the pharmaceutical company's language, which was organized around the idea that the drug was a treatment for a condition, that the condition was real, that the treatment was appropriate, that the results spoke for themselves, the language of female subjectivity, of the inner life of a woman managing a household and a body and a set of expectations in 1960, was considerably less well developed. Betty Friedan was writing The Feminine Mystique during these years. She published it in 1963, and the phrase she used, "the problem that has no name," became one of those rare cultural formulations that snaps into place over an experience people had been having without language for it. The problem she described was the dissatisfaction of educated women confined to domestic roles that did not use or acknowledge their full capacities. The Dexedrine experience was not the same as this problem, but it was adjacent to it, and the adjacency is worth noticing. The woman who took Dexedrine to meet the standard the culture set for her body was taking a pharmaceutical intervention to comply with an ideal that the culture had not examined and the medical profession had endorsed. The woman who could not explain why she felt unlike herself on the drug was lacking the language that would not arrive until 1963, the language that said, the standard is the problem, not the deviation from it. These two women are sometimes the same woman. What the women who noticed tended to notice first was the refill, the moment when the bottle was empty and the refill was due, and they found themselves thinking about the refill in a way that was subtly different from the way they thought about, for instance, the vitamin C or the aspirin. The vitamin C could wait. The refill had a particular urgency to it, not a desperate urgency, nothing theatrical, just a steady, practical orientation toward the fact of the refill's necessity. Some women noticed this and thought, that is interesting. Some thought, I'll mention it to the doctor at the next appointment. Some thought, this is what having a medication you depend on feels like, and I depend on the blood pressure medication too, so perhaps this is not different. Some thought nothing articulate about it at all. They simply went to the pharmacy, and the pharmacy gave them the refill, and they went home and the day continued. There were also the women who ran out on a weekend, who couldn't reach the doctor until Monday, who spent Friday night and Saturday in a condition they would describe, afterward, as not themselves, as grey, as flat, as though someone had turned down the contrast on everything, who on Monday morning went to the doctor with a new vocabulary for what the drug was doing, a vocabulary assembled from the 2 days of its absence. These women too are not usually in the record under their own names. They appear in the aggregate, in the refill rates that the pharmacies tracked, which increased steeply through the late 1950s and into the early 1960s, in the prescription patterns of the period which show a tendency toward shorter intervals between refills as the prescription aged, in the notes of the doctors who began to see the same patients returning sooner than the prescription schedule required. A physician in private practice in a suburb of Boston kept a journal from 1955 to 1969 that is now in the archives of a medical school library. The journal is personal rather than clinical. He was not recording patient data, which would have been in the files, but he recorded observations, and from the early 1960s onward he recorded what he was seeing in his patient population with some concern. He describes women who schedule their appointments around the prescription cycle. He describes the particular anxiety in the waiting room when refills are running low. He describes a patient, here called only Mrs. N, who told him she had begun to take an extra tablet on days when she felt she needed it, which had become most days. He had not told her to do this. He had written the prescription for 1 tablet per day. She had made the adjustment herself, in response to her own assessment of what the drug was requiring of her to maintain its effects, which is exactly how tolerance works, which is what tolerance means. The dose escalates because the effect requires it. He did not, he records, know what to tell her. He writes, I am concerned that I have created something I do not know how to uncreate. The language is personal and somewhat literary for a physician's private journal. He was worried. He refilled the prescription. He had nothing else to offer. This is the ordinary texture of the Dexedrine era in the early 1960s. Not crisis, not catastrophe, but the quiet accumulation of concern in the minds of women who were noticing, and doctors who were noticing, and nobody yet with the framework to make the accumulation mean something actionable. The women talked to each other. Not always directly. The codes of the era, the propriety around medical matters, the social awkwardness of admitting to something one was not sure how to name. These things shaped the conversations into a kind of circumference around the subject. They talked about energy, about weight, about the doctor's visit. They talked about whether the prescription still felt right, a phrase that was capable of doing a great deal of work without committing to anything specific. Sometimes one woman would say to another, "I tried stopping for a week last month," and the other woman would say, "And?" And the first woman would pause, and then she would say something that was not quite what she wanted to say, because she did not have the words for it, and they would move on to the grocery prices or the school calendar or something else entirely. The thing she could not quite say was this, that the week without the tablet felt like the world had become slightly less available, slightly less navigable, as though the tablet was not so much making her feel something as making it possible for her to feel things at all, which was not what she had been told it would do, and which she was not sure how to interpret. She put the coffee on. She thought about the refill, which was due in 3 days. Outside, the neighbourhood went about its morning, each house containing its own version of the question she did not yet have language for. There is a conversation that should have happened across tens of thousands of desks in medical offices across the United States through the 1950s and into the 1960s. It was not the conversation about whether to prescribe. That conversation happened was often brief and produced the prescription. The conversation that should have happened was the one about what to expect, about what the drug did over time, about what stopping it would feel like and when, and what to do when it did. This conversation did not happen, not systematically, not as a matter of standard practice. There were individual doctors who had it, who took the time, or who found themselves prompted to have it by a patient who asked the right question, or who had read something in a journal that gave them pause. But the conversation was not built into the clinical encounter. It was not recommended in the prescribing guidelines. It was not something the pharmaceutical company's materials encouraged the detail man to discuss. The absence of this conversation is not a mystery. It is a consequence of the information environment in which the prescribing was happening, which was an environment that had been designed to support prescribing rather than to complicate it. The conversation about stopping would have required the doctor to have information about stopping, about what stopping looked like, about the timeline of withdrawal effects, about the fact that the flatness and fatigue that appeared in the first week were not evidence that the drug was necessary but evidence that the body was recalibrating. This information existed in the research literature. It had not made its way, with any consistency, into the 11-minute consultation. The prescribing information, the document the pharmaceutical company was legally required to provide to physicians, was available in the physician's desk reference, the PDR, a large annual volume that sat in most medical offices somewhere between the filing cabinet and the window. The PDR entry for Dexedrine in 1958 included, in language that was careful and measured, information about the potential for tolerance and the possibility of what it called psychological dependence. It recommended prescribing at the lowest effective dose. It did not recommend indefinite prescribing. The PDR was consulted less often than it was intended to be. This was not unique to this drug or this era. It is a persistent finding in studies of physician prescribing behaviour that the legal prescribing information and the actual practice of prescribing diverge in ways that are well documented and only partly explicable. The gap between what the insert says and what happens in the consulting room is real, and it is wide, and it is widened by the competing information supplied by the sales force, by the medical journal advertisements, and by the collegial conversations between physicians who share practice patterns without always sharing evidence. What the consultation room said, when it said anything about the longer term, was generally reassuring. Many doctors understood Dexedrine to be safe for indefinite use at reasonable doses. The basis for this understanding was a combination of the industry's framing, the absence of dramatic adverse events in their own patient populations, and the same confident modernity that had characterized American medicine since the Second World War. The sense that pharmaceutical progress was real, accumulating and reliable, that the drugs being prescribed now were the fruits of scientific rigor, and that the scientific rigor was trustworthy. The Kefauver-Harris Amendment changed some of this. When Senator Estes Kefauver began hearings on the pharmaceutical industry in 1959, he was initially focused on pricing. The markup between manufacturing cost and retail price for branded drugs was, he had discovered, sometimes in the range of 2,000 to 3,000%. The pricing hearings were generating slow-moving legislation when, in 1961 and into 1962, reports began to arrive from Europe about a drug called thalidomide. Thalidomide had been marketed in Europe as a sedative for pregnant women, effective against morning sickness, and it had produced a pattern of birth defects, missing or malformed limbs, in thousands of children whose mothers had taken it during pregnancy. The United States had narrowly avoided a thalidomide catastrophe because a single FDA reviewer named Francis Kelsey had refused to approve the drug for the American market, on the grounds that the safety data were insufficient. The drug was legal in Europe. Kelsey required American evidence. The American evidence had not been supplied before the European reports began. Thalidomide produced the urgency that Kefauver's pricing arguments had not. The Kefauver-Harris Amendment of 1962 added the requirement, previously absent, that drugs must be proven effective before approval and strengthened the requirements around safety testing. Francis Kelsey received the President's Award for Distinguished Federal Civilian Service from John F. Kennedy. The episode is usually remembered as a story about one woman's rigorous judgment preventing a catastrophe. It did not directly address the amphetamines. The amphetamine prescribing of the 1950s and early 1960s was legal, FDA approved, and produced by drugs that had been on the market long enough that their approval predated the new efficacy requirements. Dexedrine was not recalled. The prescriptions continued. The consultation rooms continued their 11-minute encounters. What the Kefauver hearings did produce, alongside the amendment, was a period of increased public attention to the pharmaceutical industry, to its pricing, to its marketing practices, to the relationship between the industry and the medical profession. Journalists were paying closer attention. Senate staff were reading pharmaceutical company correspondence. The information environment was becoming slightly less managed. In 1965, the Drug Abuse Control Amendments placed amphetamines under greater regulatory control, categorizing them as dangerous drugs and imposing restrictions on their production and distribution. The restrictions were real, but imperfect. The prescriptions continued, at a slower rate. Some doctors stopped writing them. Some continued, in the belief that their patients' needs were genuine, and in many cases the patients' needs were genuine, in the sense that stopping the drug produced a period of difficulty that the doctor had not prepared anyone for. In 1970, the Controlled Substances Act reorganized federal drug law and placed amphetamines in Schedule II, the category reserved for drugs with high potential for abuse and accepted medical use. Schedule II meant strict controls, no refills on the prescription, limited quantities per prescription, careful record-keeping by the pharmacy. The prescribing of amphetamines to women for weight loss did not stop immediately, but it began to slow. The culture had shifted, the language had shifted, the conversation that had not happened in the consulting room was beginning to happen in other rooms. The women who had been taking Dexedrine for 5 years, or 8 years, or 10 years, found themselves in a particular situation. The prescriptions were becoming harder to obtain. Some doctors were declining to renew. The pharmacist who had written the refills without comment was now noting the Schedule II designation and asking questions. The amber bottle was not empty exactly. It was becoming harder to fill. The conversation that should have happened at the beginning was, in many cases, now happening at the end, without adequate preparation, and without an adequate word for what had been built over the years of prescribing. The word dependence was in the medical literature. The word addiction was in the newspapers, but it was attached to other drugs, to other populations, to other stories, that felt very different from the story of a suburban housewife who had been given something by her own doctor for a medical reason, and had found, after a decade, that the thing and she were intertwined in ways that were not easily undone. She did not have a word for this. She did not have a narrative for it. The narratives that existed were for other people, for jazz musicians and truck drivers and college students, and the figures in the newspaper stories that were so clearly not her story. She was a patient. She had a medical condition. She had received a medical treatment. The medical treatment was ending. What came next had a name, eventually. The name was withdrawal. But in 1970 and 1971, in the suburbs where the prescriptions had been written in their millions, it was largely experienced as a private, nameless difficulty, inside houses that did not discuss it, by women who had been managing for years and were now discovering what they had been managing against. The discovery was not dramatic. The house did not declare the discovery. The children did not know there was a discovery happening. The husband, if he noticed anything, may have noticed that the house was a little less clean for a while, that the routine was slightly disrupted, that the particular efficiency of the managed day had a different quality. He may not have noticed even this. The gap between what was being experienced and what was visible to anyone who was not the woman experiencing it was very wide. The women who went through the discontinuation of their Dexedrine prescriptions in the early 1970s went through it in the particular privacy of the domestic role. They were not observed, they were not counted, they were not offered assistance. They managed because managing was what they did, because the children still needed breakfast and the kitchen still needed the counter wiped down and the day still needed to begin. They began the day, they always began the day. This is the thing about the women in this story that is most worth holding. They began the day, every day in the conditions available to them, with the information they had, with the tools they had been given and the tools that had been taken away, and they managed the gap between what the morning required and what they had to give it. This is not a small thing. The history that is made inside houses is made of this: the daily beginning, the unremarkable persistence, the life that continues without announcement. It did not happen on a single morning. This is worth saying first because the story that emerges in retrospect always has a cleaner shape than the thing itself had while it was happening. The end of the Dexedrine era for women was not an event. It was an atmosphere change, a gradual shift in temperature that happened over years, that was felt differently in different places, that left some women with prescriptions that quietly wound down, and others with prescriptions that stopped abruptly, and others whose doctors continued to prescribe, until there was no one left who would fill it. The Controlled Substances Act of 1970 is often cited as the moment of change, and it was the most significant single regulatory event. But the cultural change that made the regulatory change possible had been building since the early 1960s, driven by a set of forces that were not primarily about amphetamines, forces that were about women, about the body, about the expectations the 1950s had built and the 1960s had begun to examine. The feminine mystique had sold more than 3 million copies by 1966. It had given language to the problem that had no name, and the language had consequences. Not immediately, not uniformly, but over time. The women who read it and recognized themselves in it were not immediately freed from the structures the book described, but they were, some of them, less inclined to accept those structures without noticing them. They were, some of them, asking different questions. The women's movement of the late 1960s was not primarily a movement about pharmaceutical prescribing, but it had things to say about pharmaceutical prescribing. The Boston Women's Health Book Collective published Our Bodies, Ourselves in 1970, a photocopied pamphlet originally, then a paperback, a book that treated the female body as territory that belonged to women to understand, that encouraged women to ask questions of their doctors and expect answers they could evaluate that were suspicious from the beginning of pharmaceutical solutions to problems that it understood as structural rather than medical. The critique was not simply that the drugs were dangerous. The critique was that the problem the drugs were solving was not the problem was. The problem the drugs were solving was a woman's body that exceeded a cultural standard for thinness. The critique said, perhaps the problem is the standard. This was not a mainstream position in 1970. It would take decades for it to become mainstream, and in some forms it has not yet arrived. But it was present in the culture, audible for the first time, and it changed the atmosphere in which the prescribing was happening. At the same time, the medical profession was producing its own concerns. Studies published in the early 1970s documented what the women in the waiting rooms had been experiencing, that amphetamine-induced weight loss was not maintained after discontinuation, that patients who stopped the drug returned to their previous weight at rates that the prescribing information had not made clear, that the appetite-suppressing effect was less robust over time than the early data suggested. The studies that the industry had not published, the ones showing no significant difference between amphetamine and placebo at 6 months, were, some of them, beginning to surface. There was also a new set of data about cardiovascular effects. Amphetamines increase heart rate and blood pressure. In the short term, in healthy patients, this is generally tolerable. In the longer term, in patients who may have undiagnosed hypertension or cardiac vulnerabilities, the picture was less comfortable. The studies were not definitive, but they were not nothing, and in the context of a regulatory environment that had become more attentive to risk after thalidomide, they were read more carefully than they might have been a decade earlier. The DEA, the Drug Enforcement Administration, created in 1973, began tracking amphetamine production quotas. The quotas for pharmaceutical amphetamines were reduced significantly through the 1970s. The production numbers declined. The prescriptions that required the drug to be produced in large quantities became prescriptions that required a smaller and more carefully monitored supply. For the women whose prescriptions had been running for years, this convergence of regulatory change and cultural shift and medical reassessment produced a practical experience that had a texture quite different from the policy discussions that were producing it. The practical experience was, the pharmacy had a new form. The pharmacy had a note on the prescription. The pharmacy called the doctor's office to verify. The doctor's office said, at the next appointment, that they were moving toward a different approach. The different approach was almost always less specific than the prescription had been. It involved advice about diet, lower calorie intake, smaller portions, less fat. It involved advice about exercise. It involved, in some cases, a referral to a program. The programs existed in various forms, ranging from the medically supervised to the peer-driven to the commercial. Weight Watchers had been founded in 1963 by Jean Nedetch, a housewife from Queens who had lost weight following a diet plan from the New York City Department of Health and realized the social meeting was as important as the food tracking. By the early 1970s, it had chapters across the country. The women who moved from their Dexedrine prescription to a Weight Watchers chapter were moving from a pharmaceutical model of weight management to a behavioral one, and the transition was not always smooth. The pharmaceutical model had given them something that did not need to be understood, only taken. The behavioral model required understanding, effort, social engagement, the construction of new habits around food in the absence of the drug that had been managing the appetite signal for years. Some women found this transition manageable, some found it very difficult, some found it impossible, at least initially, in a way that produced a period of weight regain and a sense of failure that the culture was not well equipped to contextualize as withdrawal rather than weakness. The withdrawal from amphetamines and from years of amphetamine use in patients who had been taking therapeutic doses prescribed by physicians looked, from the outside, like unhappiness. It looked like fatigue. It looked like the overeating that follows appetite suppression, the body rushing to compensate for years of suppressed hunger signals, the appetite returning with an urgency that felt like a loss of control but was actually a physiological correction. It looked like the thing the drug had been treating. This was the particular cruelty of the situation, and it was not cruel by design. It was cruel by the structural failure to have the conversation at the beginning, the failure to tell women what stopping would involve so that they could recognize it when it arrived. The women who went through this mostly went through it in private. It was not a public event. There was no collective name for it. The women who had been on Dexedrine for 8 years and whose prescriptions had ended in 1971 were not, in 1972, attending support groups for amphetamine withdrawal, because there were no support groups for this. They were managing, alone or with the quiet support of close friends, a process that had no name and no publicly acknowledged form. The stories are in the anecdotes, in memoirs published decades later, in oral histories collected by researchers who went looking, in the occasional interview where a woman of a certain age describes the early 1970s in terms that, to a reader familiar with the pharmacology, are clearly describing withdrawal from long-term amphetamine use, though the word she uses is not withdrawal. She says, "I had a very hard couple of years." She says, "I felt like I was starting over in some way." She says, "I gained the weight back, of course, and I felt terrible about that for a long time." She did not feel terrible about it for a medical reason. She felt terrible about it because the culture that had given her the prescription in the first place had not stopped holding her to the standard the prescription was meant to help her meet. The standard was still there. The prescription was gone. The gap between them was not a pharmacological problem. It was a problem without a pharmaceutical solution. The waiting room is the same room. The magazines are different. The year is 1972. The woman on the vinyl chair has a new kind of question forming, though she does not quite yet have the language for it. She's going to see the doctor about something. He will call her weight, and he will recommend a program, and she will leave with a pamphlet and an appointment card and a feeling she will not be able to name precisely for several more years. The scratch of the receptionist's pen is the same. The green walls have faded further. The silk flowers on the counter need dusting. If you stand back far enough from the history, a shape becomes visible. It is a wheel, or something like a wheel. a rotation of pharmaceutical hope and pharmaceutical consequence that repeats itself with enough consistency that the repetition, once you see it, is difficult to unsee. The details change, the drugs are different, the marketing language is updated, the waiting rooms are redecorated, but the wheel keeps turning. The 1970s cleared the Dexedrine era from the pharmacies, or most of it. The regulations tightened. The prescribing of amphetamines for weight management became controlled and then marginal, and then, for most purposes and most patients, essentially unavailable. The cultural conversation about weight did not become less intense. If anything, it intensified through the 1970s, as the women who'd been told in the 1950s that thinness was the visible proof of virtue found the standard reprinted with new justifications in a new decade's magazines. The aerobics era of the 1980s is worth noting here, not because it is primarily a pharmaceutical story, but because it is a body story. And the body story of the 1980s has a continuity with the body story of the 1950s that runs through the same cultural logic. The body as project, the body as evidence, the body as something that required continuous management, and whose failure to conform was a personal failing dressed, now, in the language of fitness rather than femininity. The aerobics classes were full of women. The diet industry was enormous. The pursuit of thinness had simply changed its aesthetic register. Into this atmosphere arrived in 1992 the drug combination that would become known as Fen-Phen. Fenfluramine had been available since the 1970s, approved for short-term use in obesity treatment. Phentermine had been available since the 1950s in the same category. Neither was new. But a cardiologist named Michael Weintraub published a study in 1992 demonstrating that the two drugs used together produced significantly greater weight loss than either alone, and that patients who stayed on the combination for 3.5 years maintained their weight loss in ways that the short-term studies had not anticipated. The publication of this study produced what can only be described as a kind of gold rush. Physicians who had not previously focused on obesity medicine found themselves with a treatment that seemed to work over the long term. The pharmaceutical industry, which had been watching the obesity market with considerable interest, responded with marketing intensity. Diet clinics opened. The combination was widely prescribed off-label, meaning for a use that the FDA had not specifically approved, which was legal, but which meant there were no clinical trials specifically evaluating the combination's long-term safety. By 1996, approximately 18 million prescriptions for Fen-Phen were being written annually. By the cultural logic of the era, the women who took it were not drug-dependent housewives. They were modern, health-conscious individuals managing a chronic disease. The language had been updated for the 1990s, but it was doing the same work as the language of the 1950s. In 1997, the FDA received reports from a cardiac clinic in Minnesota. The cardiologists there were seeing something unusual, a pattern of heart valve damage in women who'd been taking Fen-Phen. The fenfluramine component, it turned out, produced a toxic effect on heart valve cells, causing them to thicken and eventually to malfunction. The same mechanism was later identified in some patients who had taken fenfluramine alone, but the combination with phentermine may have intensified the effect. The FDA sent a letter to physicians in July 1997 describing the findings. In September 1997, fenfluramine and its close relative dexfenfluramine were withdrawn from the market. The withdrawal was abrupt. There were 18 million people on the combination, and then, within weeks, there were none. The cessation was not gradual. There was no transition plan. The patients were informed by their doctors, or read about it in the newspapers, and they stopped. The process of evaluating which patients might have developed valve damage and how to manage that damage became a major public health exercise of the late 1990s. The settlement of lawsuits related to Fen-Phen would eventually reach approximately $14 billion, one of the largest pharmaceutical litigation settlements in history. The wheel had turned. The drug had worked until it didn't. The patients had trusted the prescription until they couldn't. The marketing had been enthusiastic until the adverse events were undeniable. The withdrawal was abrupt. The consequences were largely borne by the patients. After Fen-Phen, the FDA approved sibutramine, sold as Meridia, in 1997. the same year fenfluramine was withdrawn. Sibutramine worked through a different mechanism. It was a serotonin-norepinephrine reuptake inhibitor that reduced appetite through neurochemical signaling rather than through the direct pharmacological action of amphetamines. It was approved for long-term use, which distinguished it from the previous generation of weight loss drugs. Sibutramine was prescribed through the late 1990s and 2000s to millions of patients. It produced modest but real weight loss. It was also associated with increases in blood pressure and heart rate, which the FDA monitored through post-market surveillance. A large cardiovascular outcome trial called ESCOUT, conducted through the 2000s, was designed to evaluate these concerns. The trial reported in 2010 that sibutramine increased the risk of serious cardiovascular events, heart attacks and strokes, in patients with pre-existing cardiovascular disease. Sibutramine was withdrawn from the market in October 2010. It had been available for 13 years. The withdrawal was again abrupt. The patients who had been using it long-term discontinued. The transition to alternative approaches was, again, largely unplanned. The wheel had turned again. We are now in the era of GLP-1 receptor agonists, glucagon-like peptide-1 medications, a class that includes semaglutide, sold under the brand names Ozempic and Wegovy, and liraglutide, sold as Saxenda. These drugs were originally developed for type 2 diabetes management, where they showed remarkable efficacy. The discovery that they produced significant weight loss as a side effect prompted their investigation as obesity treatments, and the trials were impressive by the standards of weight loss pharmacology. Patients lost 15 to 20% of their body weight, which is substantially more than previous drug classes had achieved. The FDA approved semaglutide specifically for obesity treatment as Wegovy in 2021. Ozempic, the diabetes formulation of the same molecule, became, through a complex dynamic of supply, demand, off-label prescribing, and celebrity endorsement, one of the most discussed pharmaceuticals in American culture by 2023. By 2024, approximately 40 million prescriptions for GLP-1 drugs had been written in the United States. The marketing language of the GLP-1 era has been updated for 2024, but it is recognizable. The drugs are described as treating a chronic disease, obesity, which was formally classified as a disease by the American Medical Association in 2013. The patients are not morally deficient or personally weak. They have a medical condition with a biological basis, and this is a medical treatment. The prescription is proof of legitimacy. The language of finally appears again. Patients describe finally having a tool that works, finally not being hungry in the way they have always been hungry, finally able to manage their relationship with food without the effort that it had always required. These accounts are genuine. The experience they describe is real. The GLP-1 medications do appear to work, at a mechanistic level, in ways that the previous drugs did not fully achieve. What is not yet fully known is what the long-term use of these drugs over decades looks like, because they have not been available over decades. The longest trials extend to about 2 years. The pattern of weight regain on discontinuation is already emerging in the literature. Patients who stop GLP-1 drugs typically regain most of their lost weight within a year, which implies indefinite use for sustained effect, which implies dependence in the practical sense, if not the pharmacological one. There are questions about pancreatitis, about thyroid effects, about the psychiatric side effects that have appeared in some post-market case reports and led to an FDA safety review in 2023. There are questions about what chronic suppression of appetite and satiety signals does to the metabolic and neurological systems that manage these functions over long time frames. The answers are not yet available. The prescriptions are being written. From the distance of this history Sutter from the waiting room in 1958 to the waiting room in 2024, it is possible to identify the questions that would be useful to ask now, that it would have been useful to ask then, that have consistently not been the central questions in the conversations about weight loss drugs and the women who take them. Who defined the problem? The standard of the female body that the prescriptions are written to meet. Who made that standard? When? With whose interests in view? What is being treated when the prescription is written? A disease, or a deviation from a cultural ideal that has been given a medical name? What happens on discontinuation, and who is responsible for managing that transition? What would the person feel like without the drug, and is the person without the drug the person or the withdrawal state? These questions are not impossible to ask. They are being asked, in some corners of medicine, and in more corners of feminist scholarship, and in the quieter conversations that women have with each other when they're trying to figure out what they actually think. They are simply not the central questions in the waiting room, where the amber bottle, or its modern equivalent, sits on the counter by the door, and the prescription is being written and the detail man's car is in the parking lot. The wheel turns. If you're still with me, drifting somewhere between wakefulness and whatever comes next, that's exactly where I hoped you'd be. Subscribe if you'd like another story waiting when you return. Sleep well. There is a particular quality to a thing that was never adequately named. It does not disappear. It accumulates, in attics, and in the backs of drawers, and in the space between what was experienced and what was ever said clearly about the experience. The women of the Dexedrine era carried something that was never given a name precise enough to match what it was, and so it sat in them with a weight that had no address. Some of them wrote about it, eventually. Not in published memoirs, mostly. The published memoirs of women of this generation tended toward the achievements, the children raised, the communities built, the losses weathered. The pharmaceutical years were a thread in the larger cloth, a thread that might have been mentioned only obliquely, if at all. But some women wrote in journals, some talked to daughters who wrote their own accounts, some, much later, responded to the surveys of researchers who had become interested in the social history of prescription medication in post-war America. What they describe across the range of these sources has a consistency that is recognizable as pattern rather than coincidence. The energy of the early years, the gradual shift from finding the drug helpful to finding the day difficult without it, the weight regained when the prescriptions ended, which arrived with an additional quality beyond the physical, a sense of having failed at the task the drug had been assigned to complete, which was a sense of having failed at being a woman in the terms the era established. Many of them did not know, when they were in the middle of it, that what they were experiencing had a pharmacological explanation. They knew they felt better with the tablet than without it. They knew the without period was difficult. They interpreted this, as they had been tacitly encouraged to interpret it by the prescribing environment, as evidence that the drug was necessary. They did not know, could not know, without information that was not given to them, that the difficult period had a timeline, that it would resolve, that the body's recalibration after long-term amphetamine use was a predictable process rather than a permanent state. The women who stopped in 1971 or 1972, when the regulatory changes made the prescriptions difficult to renew, experienced this period of recalibration without support, without explanation, and often without the understanding of the people around them. The husbands of this era were not, in the main, equipped to understand what was happening. The doctors who had written the prescriptions were not, in the main, available to explain the discontinuation process in terms that would have been genuinely helpful. There was a woman, identified in the Ohio State study as M, the initial we encountered earlier, who described the year following the discontinuation of her prescription in terms that have remained in the research record because the researcher who conducted the interview found them remarkable enough to include in full. She said, "I did not understand for a long time that I was grieving something. I thought I was just failing at life, the way I had always worried I might fail at it. But later I understood that I was grieving a version of myself that had been chemically produced, and that what I was doing was learning to be a different version, one that I hadn't known I was capable of being." This took about 2 years. I don't think I was warned about the 2 years. 2 years. The timeline of recovery from long-term amphetamine use is something that was documented in the research literature and was not communicated to patients. The acute withdrawal period, the first 2 to 4 weeks, had the most intense symptoms. The fatigue, the depressive mood, the appetite returning with force. But the longer adjustment, the full recalibration of the dopamine and norepinephrine systems that amphetamines had been modulating for years, took considerably longer. Months in some cases, longer in others. During that time, the women were living their lives. They were raising their children. They were managing their households. They were, many of them, gaining back the weight that the prescriptions had removed, and feeling terrible about this, and having nowhere to put the terrible feeling because the culture they lived in did not provide a framework for it that was not about weakness. The diet culture of the 1970s was, if anything, more intense than the diet culture of the 1950s. The 1950s had been about the body as an element of femininity, about thinness as evidence of grace and self-possession. The 1970s added a new register: health. The aerobics movement, which emerged in this decade, was organised around the idea that exercise was not merely aesthetic but medical, that the body was a system requiring maintenance, that the maintenance was the individual's responsibility. The women who had been told in the 1950s that their bodies were failing a femininity test were now told that their bodies were failing a health test. The standard was dressed differently. The standard was the same. What the women who had been through the Dexedrine era and come out the other side carried into the 1970s and the 1980s was a kind of doubled knowledge. They had taken a drug for years that had not, in the end, delivered what it promised in the terms the culture valued. They had stopped the drug and experienced something that no one had adequately prepared them for. They had returned, more or less, to the bodies they had had before, which had been defined as problems requiring pharmaceutical solutions. And they were now being asked by a new iteration of the same culture to manage those bodies through different means. Some of them were tired in a way that did not show on the outside. Some of them were sceptical in a way they kept mostly private. Some of them had daughters who were growing up in the bodies of women and who were being offered, by the same culture, new pharmaceutical solutions to the same old problems, and who made their own decisions about those solutions without, in most cases, the full benefit of their mother's experience, because their mothers had not entirely known how to speak it. The knowledge that passes between generations is selective. We pass on what we can find language for, and we pass on what we believe will be useful, and we pass on what we are not too ashamed or too tired or too uncertain to say. The knowledge of the Dexedrine era, of what it was like to take a drug your doctor gave you and feel, for a while, more capable, and then to need it, and then to lose access to it, and then to go through something unnamed without support. This knowledge passed imperfectly, through fragments and silences and the occasional direct conversation that hit the mark. There is a woman alive today who is in her 80s and who has, in the last decade, given a long interview to a researcher studying women's pharmaceutical history. She describes her Dexedrine years with the equanimity of someone who has had 50 years to arrive at a perspective on them. She says, "I think the doctors meant well. I think the companies knew what they were doing. I think I was young, and I wanted to be what my life was asking me to be. I don't know that I would have done anything differently with what I knew then. But I do wish someone had told me what was happening. What was happening? The phrase is simple and complete, and it covers everything. The pharmacology, the culture, the economics, the individual life inside the larger system. It is what anyone in a waiting room in any era deserves to know. The amber bottles are in a cabinet somewhere, in a house that has been sorted through by now, the contents given away or disposed of or put into boxes that were then put into the trash. They are not extraordinary objects. They are very ordinary objects. What they contained was ordinary medicine, prescribed by ordinary doctors in ordinary offices, taken by ordinary women in ordinary kitchens in ordinary suburbs. The ordinariness is the thing. The ordinariness is why it happened to so many people, and why so few of them knew to call it what it was. To call it what it was would have required a vocabulary that was not yet available. The vocabulary that described pharmaceutical dependence in lay terms, the word addiction, with its specific meanings and its specific stigmas, belonged to other people, other drugs, other stories. The vocabulary that described the cultural mechanism, the pharmaceutical management of women's compliance with an unjust standard, was being assembled in feminist theory, but had not yet made its way into the kitchen or the waiting room in a form that was useful to the woman standing at the counter with her amber bottle. The women carried what they carried without a word for the carrying. This is the condition of people who are inside a system that the system has not yet made visible to them. The system was doing what systems do, providing the path of least resistance through the landscape, making the prescription feel natural because everything around it was designed to make it feel natural, making the return for the refill feel routine because routine was what it was. And then, with the regulatory changes of the early 1970s, the natural and the routine became complicated, and the word for the complication was not available, and the women managed the complication with the same competence they brought to everything else, quietly, privately, without support, without acknowledgement, inside the houses that were always clean, in the kitchens with the percolators and the grocery lists and the particular silence of a morning that was having to figure out how to begin without the amber bottle. The figure of 8 million is the number that the history has settled on, approximately, for the scale of amphetamine prescribing to American women in 1960. 8 million is not a small number. 8 million is a number that, if you set it against the political movements and the cultural events of the same decade, is larger than the attendance at the March on Washington in 1963, larger than the readership of most magazines that shaped the cultural conversation of the period, comparable to the audience for certain early television events that are remembered as having changed the culture. 8 million women taking a pharmaceutical for years, and then stopping, and going through something unnamed without support, and this event has no name in the cultural record. It is not in the history books in the way that the political events of the decade are in the history books. It happened inside houses, and what happened inside houses in 1960 was not yet understood as history. It was history. It is recoverable in fragments for those who go looking. The looking is worth doing. Here is a number. Between 1970 and 2010, broad-spectrum sunscreen use among American women rose by 400%. Here is another number. In the same period, vitamin D deficiency diagnoses in women over 40 rose by 83%. These two numbers share a story, though the story is more complicated than it looks at first, and the complication is worth staying with, because it is a complication that tells you something about how the body and the culture interact, and about how the solutions we reach for sometimes produce the problems we were not anticipating. To understand how sunscreen got to 400%, you need to understand what was happening to the idea of the sun in American culture between 1960 and 1990. The sun's relationship to human skin, the basic photobiological fact of it, did not change in this period. What changed was the cultural frame through which the sun was understood. In 1960, the sun was, in the main, understood as benign. This was not ignorance. The link between sun exposure and skin cancer had been established in the scientific literature since the late 19th century, when physicians working with farmers and sailors noticed the correlation between years of outdoor work and the development of certain skin lesions. But the knowledge was medical knowledge, and medical knowledge in 1960 had not yet made the journey into consumer health culture with the insistence it would later achieve. The suntan in 1960 was still aspirational. The cultural shift towards sun-bronzed skin as a marker of health and leisure had begun in the 1920s, when Coco Chanel was photographed with a tan on the deck of a yacht, and the image migrated into fashion where it stayed. The tan said, "I have time, I have money, I have access to the sun that the indoor working classes do not." The tan was an advertisement for a life. Dermatology had concerns about this. Dermatologists had been documenting the carcinogenic effects of ultraviolet radiation on skin cells since before the Second World War, and the post-war period brought a growing body of epidemiological data connecting cumulative sun exposure to melanoma and to the non-melanoma skin cancers, basal cell carcinoma, squamous cell carcinoma, that were considerably more common but less likely to be fatal. The data was real. The hazard was real. The challenge was communication, the gap between the dermatologist's office and the beach, between the scientific understanding and the cultural practice. The gap was wide in 1960. It narrowed over the following decades, through a sustained public health effort that involved physician education, celebrity endorsements of sun safety, campaigns by cancer organizations, and eventually the transformation of sunscreen from a cosmetic product into a medical one. Sunscreen had existed since the 1930s. The first commercial sunscreen, a red veterinary petroleum jelly formulation, was developed by Benjamin Green, an airman and later a pharmacist, who tested his invention on his own head in Miami in 1944, and who eventually partnered with Coppertone to commercialize it. The earliest commercial products were designed to prevent burning rather than to block UV radiation comprehensively. They had sun protection factors in the range of 2 to 4, which reduced burning time but did not eliminate UV exposure. The science of sun protection evolved through the 1950s and 1960s. The FDA began working towards standardized SPF testing and labeling in the 1970s. By 1978, the FDA had proposed a framework for sunscreen regulation that would eventually lead to the SPF labeling system that is now standard, the number representing, in simplified terms, how much longer a person can stay in the sun before burning compared to unprotected skin. As the labeling became standardized and the dermatological message became more consistent and more public, sunscreen use began to climb. The 1980s were a decade of intensifying sun safety messaging. The Skin Cancer Foundation, established in 1979, campaigned actively for sun protection. The appearance of the ozone hole over Antarctica, widely reported from the mid-1980s onward, added urgency. The ozone layer filtered UV radiation, and its reduction implied increased UV exposure, which implied increased skin cancer risk, which implied a concrete scientific reason to change behaviour. By the late 1980s and into the 1990s, the public health message had shifted from be careful in the sun to avoid the sun and use sunscreen always. SPF recommendations climbed. The American Academy of Dermatology began recommending SPF 30 or higher for daily use. The concept of incidental sun exposure, the exposure accumulated on the walk from the parking lot, the drive to work with the window down, was identified as significant and therefore also requiring protection. Sunscreen became not just a beach product but a daily product, incorporated into moisturizers and foundations and the daily routines of women who would not have described themselves as particularly sun-exposed. The 400% increase in sunscreen use between 1970 and 2010 represents this shift. It represents a genuine and well-founded public health success. Skin cancer rates, while still significant, would have been higher without the behavioral change. Melanoma, caught early, is highly treatable, and the behavioral intervention of sunscreen use genuinely reduces incidence. The dermatological case for sunscreen is real and well supported. It is also the case that sunscreen, in blocking ultraviolet B radiation specifically, also blocks the process by which human skin synthesizes vitamin D. This is the complication, and it is not a small one. Vitamin D is not technically a vitamin. It is a prohormone, a compound that the body converts into a hormone, specifically the active form calcitriol, which operates across a remarkable range of physiological processes. The most well-established function of vitamin D is the regulation of calcium and phosphorus absorption in the gut, which is necessary for the maintenance of bone density. Vitamin D deficiency produces rickets in children, the bowed legs, the soft skulls, the bone deformities that were a significant public health problem in industrialized cities in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, before dietary fortification addressed the deficiency at the population level. But vitamin D's role in the body is considerably broader than its most famous function. The receptors for the active form of vitamin D, VDRs, or vitamin D receptors, are found in almost every tissue in the human body, including the brain, the heart, the colon, the breast, the prostate, the immune system cells. This distribution suggests that the molecule has functions in all of these tissues, though the full range of those functions is still being investigated. The research connecting vitamin D levels to health outcomes beyond bone density is extensive and, in places, contentious. The contentious parts are worth acknowledging because they are not peripheral. They are central to what makes the sunscreen vitamin D story interesting and complicated. The robust findings, supported by multiple independent studies and considered established by most researchers in the field, include: vitamin D deficiency is associated with increased risk of osteoporosis and fractures. Adequate vitamin D levels appear to modulate immune function in ways that affect susceptibility to infectious diseases. Vitamin D deficiency is associated with increased risk of autoimmune conditions, including multiple sclerosis, rheumatoid arthritis, and type 1 diabetes. The more contested findings include associations between low vitamin D levels and increased cancer risk, particularly for colorectal cancer and breast cancer, associations between vitamin D deficiency and cardiovascular disease, associations between vitamin D and depression, and specifically seasonal affective disorder, which has a plausible mechanistic basis in the reduction of sunlight exposure in winter months. The associations are real in observational data. The question of causation and whether supplementing vitamin D in deficient patients reduces these risks has been harder to answer definitively in controlled trials. The VITAL trial, published in 2019, enrolled more than 25,000 adults and randomized them to vitamin D supplementation or placebo for 5 years. The primary results were that vitamin D supplementation did not significantly reduce the risk of cancer or cardiovascular disease, the two primary endpoints, compared to placebo. This was a significant finding because it suggested that the associations observed in previous studies were not necessarily causal, that low vitamin D might be a marker of poor health rather than a cause of it. Subsequent analyses of the vital data have been more nuanced. Supplementation did appear to reduce cancer mortality in the supplemented group, even if incidence was not significantly different. There appeared to be stronger effects in participants who were vitamin D deficient at baseline. The story, like most nutrition science stories, is not settled. What is not contested is that vitamin D deficiency increased over the period in which sunscreen use increased. The 83% increase in deficiency diagnoses in women over 40 between 1970 and 2010 is a real population-level change, and the plausible explanation for it, increased sun protection reducing cutaneous vitamin D synthesis, is mechanistically sound. The human body synthesizes vitamin D in the skin through the action of UVB radiation on a compound called 7-dehydrocholesterol, which is converted first to pre-vitamin D3 and then to vitamin D3. The process requires UVB radiation specifically, not UVA, which penetrates more deeply but does not drive vitamin D synthesis. Broad-spectrum sunscreens block both UVA and UVB. A sunscreen with SPF 30, applied correctly, blocks approximately 97% of UVB radiation, and SPF 50 sunscreen blocks approximately 98%. The difference between 30 and 50 is smaller than it sounds, but either blocks most of the radiation necessary for vitamin D synthesis. Applied correctly is doing a lot of work in the previous paragraph. Studies of real-world sunscreen use consistently find that people apply less than the amount used in SPF testing, often substantially less, which means the effective SPF is lower than the labelled SPF. A person applying an SPF 30 sunscreen at half the test standard quantity is getting something more like SPF 10. This gap between labelled and effective protection has complicated both the sunscreen and the vitamin D discussions. The dermatologists and the nutritionists, in the period from roughly 2000 to the present, have been having a collegial but genuine disagreement about what to tell patients. The dermatologist's position is essentially, the risk of skin cancer from unprotected sun exposure is real and well documented. Sunscreen is effective at reducing that risk. Vitamin D deficiency can be addressed through dietary sources and supplementation. There is no need to put skin cancer risk back on the table in order to achieve adequate vitamin D. The nutritionist's position, or the subset of nutritionists and nutrition researchers who have engaged with this question, is dietary and supplemental vitamin D are not entirely equivalent to cutaneous synthesis. The additional health implications of adequate sun exposure may extend beyond vitamin D. Advising universal avoidance of sun exposure in all populations and conditions may have health costs that deserve acknowledgement. Both positions have evidence. The disagreement is in part about which risks are more serious and more reversible, and in part about how to handle uncertainty in public health communication, which is a perennial challenge for which there is no clean solution. The woman in the waiting room in 2010, a different woman in a different room, in a room that does not smell of floor wax and old paper, but of the light floral spray that has replaced both, is navigating this disagreement without access to its full complexity. She has been told consistently since the 1980s to use sunscreen every day. She has done so. She has recently been told, at this appointment or at a previous one, that her vitamin D levels are low. She's now being advised to take a supplement. She's not entirely certain how she got here, or whether the correction of one intervention with another is something she should simply accept, or something she should examine more carefully. She has a question. The question is there something I am not being told? The question is a good one. The answer is, not exactly. The information exists. The disagreement is genuine and not hidden. But the information is distributed across medical specialties that do not always speak to each other, with the coherence that would serve the patient best, and the patient's 11 minutes, the 11-minute consultation has not substantially changed, though the chair she's sitting in has improved, are not adequate to the complexity. Outside the window of this waiting room, which is on a higher floor than the 1958 one, and has a view of a parking structure, the afternoon sun is doing what it has always done. It is UV radiation moving through the atmosphere, arriving at the skin, offering its ancient metabolic bargain. The body knows what to do with it. The culture has complicated the knowing. Before there was sunscreen, before there was skin cancer awareness, before there were SPF ratings and broad-spectrum formulations and the daily moisturizer with built-in UV protection, there was skin. And before there was skin, there was light. And the relationship between the two is older than most of what we consider old. Life on this planet evolved under ultraviolet radiation. This is not an inconsequential fact. The organisms that developed photosynthesis, that developed pigmentation, that developed the ability to repair UV-damaged DNA, they all developed these capacities in dialogue with a sun that was and remains a significant source of both energy and damage. The human skin is a record of several 100,000 years of that dialogue. It contains its own UV filtering compounds, its own repair mechanisms, its own conversion pathways for turning UV radiation into something biochemically useful. The vitamin D synthesis pathway is one of the oldest of these. Phytoplankton synthesize compounds similar to vitamin D when exposed to UV light. Invertebrates have versions of the pathway. The vertebrate version, which produces the cholecalciferol that we call vitamin D3, appears in fish and has been present in some form for more than 500 million years. This is not a vitamin that evolution left on the table as an optional feature. It is deeply embedded. The skin contains 7-dehydrocholesterol, a precursor molecule that sits in the plasma membranes of cells in the epidermis and dermis. When UVB radiation, specifically the range between 290 and 350 nanometers, strikes the skin, it converts 7-dehydrocholesterol to previtamin D3 in a photochemical reaction. Previtamin D3 then undergoes thermal isomerization, a temperature-driven conversion, to vitamin D3. The vitamin D3 is then transported to the liver and converted to 25-hydroxyvitamin D, which is the form measured in blood tests and used as the marker of vitamin D status. From the liver, it goes to the kidneys and is converted to the active form, 1,25-dihydroxyvitamin D or calcitriol, which is what actually binds the vitamin D receptors distributed throughout the body. This is a multi-step process that evolved without a supplement industry, without fortified milk, without soft gel capsules of D3 available in the vitamin aisle. It evolved in the context of bodies that were outside, in sunlight, for significant portions of the day. Bodies that were farming, hunting, gathering, building, living their lives in a physical relationship with the outdoors that is very different from the climate-controlled indoors of contemporary life. The question of how much sun exposure is needed to maintain adequate vitamin D levels has a surprisingly complex answer, and the complexity is illuminating about why the disagreement between dermatologists and nutritionists has been difficult to resolve. The variables include latitude, because UVB intensity varies significantly with the angle of sunlight and is lowest at high latitudes. Season, for the same reason, in much of the United States above the 37th parallel, UVB intensity is insufficient for vitamin D synthesis from roughly October through March. Time of day, because UVB intensity is highest around solar noon. Skin pigmentation, because melanin absorbs UVB radiation and reduces the rate of vitamin D synthesis, which is one mechanism underlying the higher rates of vitamin D deficiency in darker-skinned populations living at higher latitudes. Age, because the capacity of skin to synthesize vitamin D declines with age, roughly halving between young adulthood and age 70. And body surface area exposed because a forearm and a face produce far less vitamin D per minute than a back and legs. Research attempting to quantify adequate sun exposure for vitamin D synthesis has produced estimates that vary considerably across these variables. A light-skinned person in Miami in July, exposing face and arms to midday sun, may synthesize the equivalent of 1,000 IU of vitamin D in 10 to 15 minutes. The same person in Boston in January may produce essentially none. A person with darker skin may require 3 to 5 times longer exposure to produce the same amount. The current recommended dietary allowance for vitamin D, as set by the Institute of Medicine, now the National Academy of Medicine, is 600 IU per day for adults up to age 70 and 800 IU for adults over 70. These values were established in 2010 and are aimed at supporting bone health specifically. Many vitamin D researchers believe these values are too low to support the full range of vitamin D's functions and recommend levels of 1,000 to 2,000 IU per day. The Endocrine Society, which has taken a more aggressive position on vitamin D optimization, recommends even higher levels for certain populations. The serum level of 25-hydroxyvitamin D that constitutes sufficiency has also been debated. The Institute of Medicine defines deficiency as below 20 nanograms per milliliter, and sufficiency as above that threshold. Many clinical researchers and endocrinologists prefer a target of 30 nanograms per milliliter, or higher for optimal health effects. The difference between these thresholds has consequences for how many people are classified as deficient. The IOM threshold produces a smaller deficiency prevalence than the 30 nanograms per milliliter threshold. The 83% increase in deficiency diagnoses observed from 1970 to 2010 reflects, in part, the lowering of the threshold as clinical understanding evolved, as well as genuine change in population vitamin D levels. Dietary sources of vitamin D are limited. The foods naturally highest in vitamin D are fatty fish, salmon, mackerel, sardines, tuna, which contain meaningful amounts, typically in the range of 300 to 600 EU per serving. Egg yolks contain small amounts. Beef liver contains small amounts. Mushrooms exposed to UV light, which is not their natural state in commercial growing, can contain meaningful amounts. This is essentially the complete list of significant natural dietary sources. The fortification of milk with vitamin D, which began in the 1930s in the United States as a public health response to the rickets epidemic, added another source. American milk is typically fortified to 401 U per quart, about 100 EU per cup. Fortified orange juice, fortified cereals, and fortified plant milks add to the pool. But even a diet that includes these foods routinely is unlikely to provide more than 400 to 600 EU per day from food sources, which is at or below the IOM threshold, and well below the levels recommended by more aggressive clinical guidelines. This means that for populations who are indoors most of the day, or who live at high latitudes, or who consistently use sunscreen, or who have darker skin, or who are older, supplementation is probably the most practical route to adequate vitamin D. The supplements are inexpensive, widely available, and safe at doses up to at least 4,000 IU per day, the tolerable upper limit established by the IOM. Toxicity from vitamin D supplementation is rare, and generally requires sustained intake of doses substantially above this level. The question of whether supplemental vitamin D has the same effects as cutaneous vitamin D synthesis is an active one in the research literature. Some researchers believe that the two are metabolically equivalent, that the molecule is the same molecule and the downstream effects are the same regardless of its source. Others argue that sun exposure has health effects beyond vitamin D synthesis that are not replicated by supplements, including the release of nitric oxide from skin during UVB exposure, which has effects on blood pressure and cardiovascular function, and the influence of light exposure on circadian rhythms and melatonin production, which have implications for sleep and mood regulation. The nitric oxide finding is particularly interesting. A series of studies by Richard Weller and colleagues at the University of Edinburgh, beginning around 2010, found that UVB exposure releases stores of nitric oxide from the skin into the circulation, producing measurable reductions in blood pressure. The magnitude of the effect was meaningful, comparable to some blood pressure medications, and appeared to occur through a mechanism entirely separate from vitamin D. This suggests that the skin-sun interaction has cardiovascular implications that are not captured by measuring vitamin D levels, and that blocking sun exposure to the skin may have effects on blood pressure regulation that supplemental vitamin D cannot replicate. The circadian dimension adds another layer. Light exposure, and specifically the UV-containing outdoor light of morning and midday, is a primary Zeitgeber, the German word for time giver, the environmental cue that synchronizes the body's internal clocks. The human circadian system evolved in dialogue with the sun's daily cycle, and disruption of that dialogue, through excessive indoor living, through avoidance of natural light, through artificial light at night, is associated with a range of health problems including sleep disorders, depression, metabolic disruption, and increased cancer risk. None of this means that sunscreen is bad, or that the dermatological advice to protect skin from UV damage is wrong. The skin cancer data is real, and the protective effect of sunscreen is real. The question is one of calibration, of how much protection, when, in which populations, combined with what compensatory strategies for the metabolic functions that UVB exposure supports. The practical synthesis that emerges from the current evidence, held in the hands of researchers who have spent time with all sides of it, looks something like this. Brief, regular sun exposure. 15 to 30 minutes of midday sun, a few days per week to face and arms and ideally some larger skin surface, is probably beneficial for most people, most of the time, and the vitamin D synthesis and other photobiological effects it produces are probably not replicated by supplementation alone. Beyond this exposure, particularly for prolonged outdoor activities, or for people with fair skin or personal or family history of skin cancer, protection with sunscreen and protective clothing is appropriate. Daily supplementation with 1000 to 2000 IU of vitamin D3 is appropriate for most adults, and particularly for those who are older, have darker skin, live at high latitudes, or are consistently indoors. This is not a simple message. It is not reducible to a slogan. It is the kind of message that requires the 11-minute consultation to be something other than what the 11-minute consultation usually is, to be an individualized conversation about the specific person in the chair, their latitude and skin tone and history and outdoor habits, and current vitamin D levels and cardiovascular risk profile, and the full complexity of the trade-off they are navigating. Such consultations happen. They happen with increasing frequency as more physicians are trained in integrative approaches, as the research linking sun exposure to outcomes beyond skin cancer becomes better known, as patients arrive at appointments with more information and more specific questions. They still take approximately 11 minutes. The dermatologist has a poster in her waiting room. The poster shows a woman in a broad-brimmed hat and a long-sleeve shirt, holding an umbrella at a slight angle against the sky. She's smiling. Behind her the sun is bright, and the world is summery, and she is protected from it. The poster says something about sun safety. The message is clear and the image is appealing, and the woman in the poster looks like someone who's doing everything correctly. The endocrinologist's waiting room does not have a poster about sunscreen. The endocrinologist has in the last decade become more interested in vitamin D, which has become more interesting as the research on its non-skeletal functions has accumulated. The endocrinologist's patients are arriving with vitamin D levels in the low normal range, or below normal, and the endocrinologist is recommending supplementation and, in some cases, advising them to get a little more sun. The patient goes from one waiting room to the other, carrying the advice that does not perfectly reconcile itself into a single consistent message. She's a careful woman. She reads the information she can find. She discovers that the information does not agree with itself, that the experts are not in conflict exactly, but are emphasizing different aspects of the same complicated truth, that there is no simple answer to the question she's brought to them. This experience of being caught between experts who are each correct within their domain but not talking to each other across domains is one of the characteristic experiences of contemporary healthcare. Medicine has specialized with considerable success. The specialist knows their domain in depth and can offer care within it that a generalist could not replicate. The cost of specialization is fragmentation. The patient who needs advice that crosses specialties must do the integration herself in the waiting room without a medical degree. The women who navigated the Dexedrine era were also caught between experts, though in a different configuration. The experts in that era were not in productive disagreement. They were in alignment, but the alignment was shaped by an information environment that the industry had managed. The disagreement that should have happened didn't, which meant the patient received a clearer message than the evidence warranted. Clarity is not always a sign of correctness. The sunscreen vitamin D situation has the opposite problem. The evidence is being communicated honestly, more or less. Both sides of the genuine disagreement are accessible to patients who seek them out. The problem is that the disagreement is confusing in a way that for some patients produces paralysis, and for others produces the particular exhaustion of having to make a complex trade-off assessment with inadequate information at a time when they would prefer to simply be told what to do. The preference for being told what to do is understandable, and it is one of the conditions that the pharmaceutical and healthcare industries understand very well and have, historically, been happy to serve. The amber bottle is, among other things, a simplification. It reduces a complex set of trade-offs, about the body, about risk, about the value of different health outcomes, to a single intervention. You take this. The problem this treats gets managed. You do not have to think about the interaction between the problem and the solution, or about what the solution does to other systems, or about whether the definition of the problem was correct in the first place. The simplification is appealing because the alternative, living with complexity, making individualized assessments, integrating contradictory expert advice into a personalized approach, is cognitively and emotionally demanding. It is work. It is work that falls disproportionately on women, who are both more likely to be patients in the healthcare system and more likely to be responsible for the health decisions of the household they manage. A woman in 2024 trying to figure out what to do about sunscreen and vitamin D is navigating a genuine trade-off with incomplete information in a context where the experts she trusts are giving her advice that comes from different frames, with different risk hierarchies and different implicit assumptions about which outcomes matter most. She is doing this in the time she has available, which is the time between work and children and everything else the day contains. She is probably going to land somewhere reasonable. Most people, given honest information and time to think, land somewhere reasonable. But the path to reasonable is harder than it needs to be, and the hardness is not inevitable. It is a product of a healthcare system that has organised itself around specialties rather than patients, and of a public health communication environment that has organised itself around simple messages rather than complete ones. The simple message about sunscreen, use it, always, everywhere, high SPF, is not wrong. It is incomplete. The simple message about vitamin D, take a supplement, your levels are low, is not wrong. It is also incomplete because the supplement addresses some but not all of the mechanisms through which sun exposure supports health, and because the supplement does not address the question of whether there is a level of sun avoidance that produces health costs, the supplement cannot compensate. The complete message is something like this: the sun is not your enemy, and it is also not unconditionally your friend. Your relationship with it requires calibration, and the calibration depends on things specific to you: where you live, what your skin is like, what your health history is, how much time you spend outdoors under what conditions, what your vitamin D levels are currently, and what you value in the trade-off between the risks the sun presents and the benefits it offers. 15 to 30 minutes of daily sun exposure without sunscreen to a moderate area of skin, enough to produce some pinkening in very fair skin, less in darker skin, is broadly beneficial for most people and represents a quantity of exposure unlikely to materially increase skin cancer risk in the absence of other risk factors. Beyond this, protection is appropriate. This message requires a conversation. The conversation requires time and individualized attention, and a practitioner who has thought about the full complexity rather than defaulting to the specialty's standard message. This conversation is happening more often than it was. It is still not happening often enough. There is a woman who has been coming to her dermatologist annually for 15 years. She has good skin. She has no family history of melanoma. She has been using SPF 50 sunscreen on her face every morning since 1994, and SPF 30 on her arms and legs whenever she's outdoors. Her vitamin D level, at her last physical, was 18 nanograms per milliliter, below the IOM's sufficiency threshold of 20 and well below the clinical target of 30. Her primary care physician recommended 2000 IU of D3 daily. She asked her dermatologist about this at her next visit. She asked whether she should reduce her sunscreen use to allow more vitamin D synthesis. Her dermatologist said no. Sunscreen should not be reduced. Vitamin D should be supplemented. She asked whether the supplement was equivalent to sun exposure for all the functions vitamin D supported. Her dermatologist paused and then said that the evidence for sun exposure beyond what she was currently getting was not convincing enough to justify the risk, and that the supplement would cover her vitamin D needs. This is a defensible answer. It is the answer a conscientious dermatologist gives. It is also not the full answer, because the full answer requires knowledge of the nitric oxide findings, of the circadian effects of outdoor light, of the emerging research on non-vitamin D photobiological effects, knowledge that is in the literature but not yet in the standard training of most dermatologists. She left the appointment with a supplement recommendation and a continued uncertainty. She was not alarmed. She was thoughtful. She had more questions than when she arrived. This is perhaps the most honest outcome available at this particular moment in the science. The questions are real. The answers are incomplete. The experts are working on it. The patients are waiting in various waiting rooms for a synthesis that is still being assembled. The afternoon light comes through the window at an angle that's neither threatening nor inert. It's simply light, doing what it has always done, offering its ancient metabolic bargain to the skin that sits beneath it. The body, as it has always been, is ready to respond. The question is what the mind, armed with all its complicated and incomplete information, decides to do. There is no alarm in this. There is only the ordinary difficulty of being a person in a time when the evidence is real and partial and ongoing, when the experts are honest and specialized and not yet speaking to each other with the coherence the patient deserves, when the waiting room chair is a little more comfortable than it used to be, but the 11 minutes have not substantially expanded. She drives home in the afternoon light. She has decided tentatively to take the D3 supplement and also to walk outside at noon for 20 minutes without sunscreen on her arms. She's not certain this is correct. She's reasonably confident it is not harmful. She'll mention it to her doctor at the next appointment, which is in 6 months. The afternoon is warm and specific, and hers. Stand back far enough from both stories, us, the amphetamine story and the sunscreen vitamin D story, and something becomes visible that is less about either drugs or UV radiation, and more about the particular relationship between women's bodies and expert advice in the 20th and 21st centuries. The relationship has a consistent structure. There is a problem, defined as such by a combination of cultural standards, medical consensus, and industry interest in varying proportions depending on the era. There is an expert or set of experts who have an intervention for the problem. The intervention is presented as the solution. The women who follow the advice do so in good faith, in the context of their actual lives, with the information available to them. Time passes. Something emerges that complicates the story, a side effect, a trade-off, a pattern of outcomes that was not in the original description of the intervention. The complication is real in both stories. Amphetamines prescribed for obesity did produce genuine dependence in many women who used them for years, and the end of the prescribing era was not managed in a way that served those women well. Broad-spectrum sunscreen use, adopted in good faith in response to genuine and serious public health messaging, has contributed to a reduction in UVB exposure at a population level that has produced measurable changes in vitamin D status. Both complications are worth taking seriously. What is interesting in holding the two stories together is the consistency of the mechanism by which the complication was produced. In both cases, an intervention was recommended on the basis of an accurate understanding of a specific risk, without adequate consideration of the full system in which the intervention would operate. Dexedrine was prescribed because it produced weight loss, and weight loss was understood as the goal, without adequate consideration of what sustained amphetamine use did to the neurochemical systems regulating appetite, mood, and energy over time. Sunscreen was recommended because it reduced UV exposure, and reducing UV exposure was understood as the goal, without adequate consideration of what comprehensive UV avoidance did to the photobiological systems that had evolved to receive regular sun exposure. The system thinking that was missing in both cases is not a simple failure. It is genuinely difficult. The body is a system of systems, and the full consequences of intervening in one system reverberate through others in ways that are not always predictable in advance, and sometimes not visible, until the intervention has been in place for years or decades. The field of pharmacology has become considerably more sophisticated about off-target effects and long-term safety monitoring since the Dexedrine era. The field of photobiology has become more sophisticated about the full range of biological functions supported by sun exposure since the pure anti-cancer messaging of the 1980s. The sophistication is real. It is also always imperfect, and always running behind the deployment of interventions at scale. The gap between what the specialist knows and what the population is doing is a permanent feature of public health, not a temporary one. What women have experienced in this gap, in both stories, includes real benefit and real unintended consequences, and the balance between them is different for different individuals. The woman who avoided skin cancer because she used sunscreen, and the woman who had seriously low vitamin D because she avoided the sun, are not necessarily different women. They might be the same woman. The woman who lost weight with Dexedrine and felt for years that she was managing her life more effectively, and the woman who had a terrible 2 years after her prescription ended, are also not necessarily different women. The same intervention produced both experiences in many individuals. The lesson if there is one, is something about the importance of the full story. The story that includes the mechanism of action and the long-term effects. The story that includes the trade-offs rather than just the benefits. The story that gives people the information they need to make calibrated decisions rather than the simplified message optimized for population-level compliance. This is easier to say than to do. Population-level public health communication operates at scale, which means it operates in simplifications. The simple message reaches more people more reliably than the nuanced one. The nuanced message reaches some people very well and loses others in the complexity. The choice between simple and nuanced is a genuine trade-off, and reasonable people who care about public health have disagreed about it throughout the history of health communication. What is perhaps most useful, at the level of the individual patient in the individual waiting room, is the recognition that the expert advice she receives is not the final word. It is the best current synthesis of incomplete information, subject to revision as more information becomes available, operating within a specialty frame that does not capture everything relevant, and filtered through an institutional relationship between medicine and industry that has not always served her interest optimally. This recognition is not cynicism. The experts are, in the main, people who are trying to do their best with what they know. The institutions are, in the main, institutions that are attempting to serve the public health. The pharmaceutical companies are, in the main, companies that contain many people who genuinely believe in the products they make. None of this produces perfect outcomes, and the women who have navigated the various eras of expert advice about their bodies have known this without always having language for it. They have known it in the particular embodied way of someone who lives in a body that receives the advice and then reports back on what the advice produces. The reports have not always matched the predictions. The gap between the prediction and the outcome has sometimes been educational and sometimes costly. The women of the Dexedrine era carried their amber bottles home and did their best. The women of the Sunscreen era applied their SPF 50 every morning and did their best. The women taking GLP-1 agonists in 2024 are doing their best with what they have been told and what they can observe in their own experience. The women who are trying to figure out the sunscreen vitamin D trade-off are doing their best with incomplete, contradictory expert information that is being assembled in real time. Doing your best with incomplete information is not a failure. It is what living in time means. The information is always incomplete. The consequences of decisions are always partly unpredictable. The experts are always partly wrong, not because they are incompetent, but because the systems they are advising on are more complex than their models of those systems, and the gap between the model and the system is where the unexpected consequences live. The useful question is not what should I have done differently, which is almost always asked with the benefit of hindsight that was not available at the time. The useful question is, what do I know now, and what am I still not being told, and who should I ask? The useful question is also, is there a version of what the expert is recommending that I can investigate further before fully committing to it? Is the prescription the only option, or is it the simplest option? Is the simple message accurate, or is there a more complete message that would serve me better even if it requires more effort to act on? These questions are more available to patients now than they were in 1958. The information is more accessible, the culture of patient advocacy is more developed, the expectation that patients should be active participants in their own healthcare rather than passive recipients of expert decisions has taken root in ways it had not by the Dexedrine era. This is real progress. The amber bottle is smaller now and has different chemicals in it and is sold with a different story. The wheel keeps turning. The women in the waiting rooms keep sitting in chairs that have improved considerably in quality and comfort since 1958. The light through the window is the same light. The scratch of the pen on the prescription pad is the same scratch. The woman who notices, who asks the question, who does not accept the simple message as the final word, she has always been there. She's harder to dismiss than she used to be. This is the form that progress takes when it takes it. The sunscreen industry in 2023 was valued at approximately $11 billion globally. This is not a figure anyone designed toward, though anyone who looked at the trajectory of sun safety messaging through the 1980s and 1990s and followed it to its logical commercial conclusion could have approximated the destination. The industry grew alongside the messaging, and the messaging grew alongside the industry, and the relationship between the two is as intertwined as it has ever been in the history of pharmaceutical and personal care marketing. This is not a conspiracy, it is a market. When there is a large and growing population of people with a concern, and skin cancer is a genuine and serious concern, not a manufactured one, and a product that addresses that concern, the product will be sold with some energy. The energy of selling will support the energy of concern, because concerned customers are purchasing customers, and the reinforcement of concern through advertising is not distinct from the reinforcement of the public health message. They run on the same rails. The sunscreen industry learned from the pharmaceutical industry in certain respects, because many of the large consumer health companies are adjacent to pharmaceutical companies, and the marketing disciplines move between them. The concept of expanding the indication, taking a product marketed for one use and extending its reach into adjacent uses, broadening the population that understands itself to need the product, is a pharmaceutical marketing concept that the sunscreen industry applied with some flair. The daily moisturizer with SPF 15 that appeared in the late 1980s was a product that expanded the indication of sunscreen from people who are going to be in the sun to all women, all days, regardless of sun exposure. The message was incidental sun exposure. The walk to the car, the lunch break outside, the drive with the window down, was accumulating in meaningful ways and protection was warranted. The message was not wrong. It was also not without benefit to the companies selling the product. The anti-aging dimension of sunscreen marketing was particularly sophisticated. Beginning in the late 1980s and accelerating through the 1990s, sunscreen was positioned not just as cancer prevention, but as wrinkle prevention. Photoaging, the visible aging of skin caused by UV exposure, which includes wrinkles, age spots, and changes in skin texture, was identified as a compelling motivator for consumers who might not respond to statistics about cancer risk, but who were very attentive to the appearance of their skin. This was a market insight of considerable power. The women who had been told since the late 1960s that they should be concerned about skin cancer were now told that the same intervention would also preserve their youthful appearance. The two messages reinforced each other and broadened the product's appeal. Cancer prevention might have been enough for some customers, anti-aging was enough for a larger set. The anti-aging marketing of sunscreen intersected in complex ways with the diet culture that had produced the Dexedrine era, though the connection was not direct. Both were organized around the idea of the female body as a project requiring continuous management. Both positioned pharmaceutical and personal care products as tools for the management project. Both created markets by defining standards against which the natural body could be measured and found insufficient. The natural skin, aging as skin, ages when exposed to the sun over a lifetime. This was now a deviation from the standard, a failure of management, something that could have been prevented with the right products applied consistently over time. The woman who had not used sunscreen in her 30s and now had visible photoaging in her 50s had, by the logic of the marketing, made an error. The error was correctable. With more products, more interventions, the resurfacing treatments and the topical retinoids and the photoprotection protocols that would slow further damage. The dermatology industry benefited from this frame. The cosmetic dermatology market, which includes treatment for photoaging alongside the management of skin cancer, grew substantially through the 2000s and 2010s. The appointment at which the dermatologist recommended daily SPF 50 was also sometimes the appointment at which she recommended a light chemical peel or a discussion of injectable fillers. The products and the treatments formed a continuous commercial ecosystem organized around the aging female face. None of this is sinister in a simple way. The skin cancer prevention is real, and the treatments for photoaging are sought by people who have genuine concerns about their appearance and who benefit, by their own assessment, from the interventions available. The question is not whether the industry should exist, but whether the information environment it creates is the information environment best suited to the patient's actual interests. The information environment created by the sunscreen industry, like the information environment created by the amphetamine industry 60 years earlier, is organized around a product. It foregrounds the risks that the product addresses and backgrounds the risks that the product creates or fails to address. It defines the problem in the way that makes the product the solution. This is what product-centered information environments do, and it is why they are not the same as patient-centered information environments, even when the information they contain is accurate. The dermatologist who recommends daily SPF of 50 to every patient regardless of skin type, sun exposure, latitude, or vitamin D status is following the guideline. The guideline was developed by an organisation whose funding includes industry support. The organisation's members practice in a specialty that benefits from the consistent recommendation of the guideline's product. The members genuinely believe in the recommendation. The funding influences the frame within which evidence is evaluated, not the honesty with which it is reported. This is how institutional framing works, and it is why the individual practitioner can be entirely honest while the institutional environment systematically produces biased information. This does not mean the guideline is wrong. It means the guideline should be evaluated in the context of who produced it and what interest they serve, which is a condition of all guidelines and is not always made explicit to patients. The patient sitting in the dermatologist's waiting room looking at the poster of the woman in the broad-brimmed hat and the long-sleeved shirt is receiving information that is accurate as far as it goes. It does not go as far as she might need it to go to make a decision that serves the full complexity of her health. She will make the decision that she makes, with the information she has in the time available to her. She will probably do reasonably well with it. The information she's missing will remain missing until she finds it somewhere else. A different specialist, an article, a conversation with a friend who went through something similar, a question she thinks to ask at the next appointment. The women of the Dexedrine era found their way eventually to a clearer understanding of what had happened to them, not because the information became available easily, but because time passed and the story accumulated and the individual experience was joined to other individual experiences until the pattern was legible. The vitamin D story is younger and the clarity is still forming. The research is ongoing. The experts are in genuine dialogue, even when the dialogue is contentious. The patients are paying attention, and their attention is sharper and better informed than it was in 1958, because the information environment has changed, because patient advocacy exists, because the internet, for all its problems, has distributed access to primary research in ways that were not possible when the information was confined to medical journals and detail men's sample cases. The woman who asked her dermatologist about nitric oxide, about circadian effects, about the evidence for sun exposure beyond what sunscreen-managed incidental exposure allows, she may not get a full answer in the 11 minutes available, but she is asking the question. The question itself is a form of progress. The amber bottle has changed shape. It is now white and comes in a pump dispenser. The label says broad-spectrum SPF, 50+, and reef-safe and dermatologist-tested, and several other things that mean something, and a few that mean less. It sits on the bathroom shelf next to the vitamin D supplement, which also changed shape from the amber bottles of the 1960s, and is now a small, clear, soft gel. 2 products on one shelf, 2 interventions in one morning routine, both recommended by experts, both addressing something real, both part of a story that is still being told. There is a practical synthesis available in this material, though assembling it requires the willingness to hold 2 legitimate bodies of expert advice simultaneously, and extract from the tension between them something that is more useful than either alone. It begins with the body. Not with the fear of the body, not with the body as a site of risk requiring management, but with the body as a system that has been doing the work of living for as long as there have been bodies doing the work of living, which is longer than the pharmaceutical industry, longer than the sunscreen industry, longer than the waiting room with its green walls and its vinyl chairs and its amber bottles. The body has a relationship with the sun. This relationship is old and functional, and partly understood, and partly still being investigated. The body synthesizes vitamin D when UV light reaches the skin. The body releases nitric oxide when UV light reaches the skin. The body uses outdoor light to calibrate its circadian rhythms, to regulate mood, to anchor the daily cycle of melatonin and cortisol that organizes sleep and wakefulness, and the hormonal patterns that underlie energy and appetite, and a dozen other things the endocrinologist and the psychiatrist and the sleep researcher have begun to map. The body also accumulates UV damage. The body's DNA repair mechanisms, which evolved in dialogue with daily UV exposure, are capable of managing moderate UV exposure over a lifetime without producing malignant transformation. They are not infallible, and they are not infinite. Cumulative high-intensity UV exposure, the kind produced by burning, by years of unprotected beach and outdoor work, by the specific pattern of intermittent high-dose exposure that is most strongly associated with melanoma, exceeds their capacity in some individuals, producing skin cancers that range from easily treated to life-threatening. These two facts are both true. They coexist without contradiction, though the conversation about them has sometimes been structured as though they are in contradiction, as though supporting the body's relationship with the sun and preventing UV damage are competing goals rather than calibratable ones. The calibration based on the current state of the evidence looks something like this. For the question of vitamin D, most adults in most parts of the world living modern, indoor lives are producing less cutaneous vitamin D than their bodies would produce with the sun exposure their ancestors received. This is a measurable fact about the contemporary human condition, not a speculation. The measurement is a blood test, the 25-hydroxyvitamin D test, sometimes called vitamin D25OH, which is a standard test available through primary care. A result below 20 nanograms per milliliter is generally considered deficient. Most clinicians working in this area aim for a result of 30 to 50 nanograms per milliliter for general health. If the test shows deficiency, supplementation is appropriate and effective. Vitamin D3 is the preferred supplement form, as it is more potent than D2 and raises serum levels more reliably. A dose of 1,000 to 2,000 IU per day is reasonable for most adults with mild to moderate deficiency. Higher doses may be appropriate in consultation with a physician for more significant deficiency or for populations with increased needs. Retesting after 2 to 3 months of supplementation confirms whether the dose is adequate. For the question of sun exposure, the evidence supports brief, regular, non-burning sun exposure as beneficial for most people. The beneficial effects include vitamin D synthesis, but extend beyond it, into the cardiovascular effects of nitric oxide release and the circadian and mood effects of natural light. A reasonable practical target is 15 to 30 minutes of direct sun exposure, ideally around solar noon when UVB is strongest, on skin areas that include more than just face and hands, arms, legs, back when possible. The frequency needed to meaningfully support vitamin D synthesis depends on latitude, season, and skin tone. In summer at lower latitudes, a few exposures per week may be sufficient, while in winter at higher latitudes supplements may be the more practical route. This is the exposure that should occur without sunscreen on the skin being exposed. After the recommended exposure period, and after this period only, not instead of it, applying sunscreen for additional time outdoors is appropriate, particularly for fair-skinned individuals and those with personal or family history of skin cancer. For people with melanoma history, very fair skin, a genetic predisposition to skin cancer, or who have been advised by a dermatologist after individual assessment to minimize all UV exposure, this equation shifts. The cancer risk is real, and for some individuals predominant, and the vitamin D discussion becomes secondary to the primary objective of minimizing malignant risk. These individuals should discuss their specific situation with their dermatologist and supplement aggressively under medical supervision. For the majority of adults, however, who are currently following universal sun avoidance and high SPF guidelines without a specific elevated skin cancer risk, the nuanced approach, brief, regular, protected sun exposure followed by supplementation, is probably closer to optimal than the simple message they have been given. The conversation about this should be happening in the doctor's office. It is happening with increasing frequency as the research on vitamin D and photobiology has become better known, and as the specialty silos have begun to communicate more across their boundaries. It is happening in primary care offices where physicians trained in integrative medicine are asking questions that would not have been asked 20 years ago. It is happening in the context of the growing patient advocacy movement that has pushed medicine toward more individualized patient-centered care. It is not happening consistently or universally. The conversation in the waiting room is still often organized around the simple message rather than the nuanced one, because the simple message is what the 11-minute consultation can reliably deliver, and because the simple message is what the specialty guideline says, and because the specialty guideline reflects the evidence as filtered through a frame that has not yet fully integrated the photobiological research. The women of 2026 are, in this respect, better positioned than the women of 1958. They have more information, more access to it, more cultural permission to question the standard advice, and more practitioners willing to engage with the complexity. They are navigating a more complicated information environment because the complication of the information is itself a form of progress. The simple message was never the complete message. The incomplete message was always causing some fraction of the problems the patients were experiencing. Knowing that the message is incomplete is the beginning of asking for the complete one. It is also, in some ways, the end of a certain kind of comfort. The comfort of being told what to do and trusting that it is right. The comfort of the prescription as absolution. The nuanced message requires the patient to become, to some degree, the integrator, to take the dermatologist's evidence and the endocrinologist's evidence and sit with the tension between them and arrive at something that serves the full complexity of her specific body and her specific situation. This is more work. It is also more honest. And there is something to be said for honesty, even when it is more demanding, even when it requires sitting with a question that does not resolve into a clean answer. The women who carried the amber bottles in their handbags in 1960 were, in a way, purchasing the comfort of a clean answer. The answer was not as clean as it looked. The cleaning up of that answer took years and produced real costs. The message worth carrying into the bathroom in the morning is something like, be thoughtful about the sun, because it is real and has real effects in both directions. Get some. Protect against excess. Test your vitamin D and supplement if indicated. Ask more questions than the specialist has time to answer, and then find the time to ask them. The body has been doing this longer than any of us have been around to advise it. It has resources that the supplement cannot replicate and the sunscreen cannot replace. The question is how to support those resources rather than inadvertently override them. The afternoon sun comes through the window at the angle that it comes through windows at this time of year, in this place, at this latitude. It falls on the arm of the woman reading this, or listening to this, wherever she is. Her skin knows what to do with it. The rest is calibration. There are particular lives inside the aggregate numbers. The 8 million women of 1960 are, in the historical record, mostly aggregate. They appear in prescription databases, in pharmaceutical sales records, in the survey data of researchers who came later and tried to quantify what had happened. The individual lives are less well documented, because individual lives in this era were not considered interesting or important enough to document in the ways that later became standard. They are recoverable only in fragments, in journals, in letters, in the oral histories that researchers like the one at Ohio State collected when the women were in their 60s and 70s and willing finally to describe what they remembered. What the fragments show is variety, which the aggregate obscures. Not all 8 million women had the same experience. The Dexedrine era was not a monolith. It was 8 million individual calibrations of a pharmaceutical with inconsistent effects in bodies that were different from each other, managed by doctors with different levels of attention and knowledge, in households with different pressures and different supports, and different capacities to accommodate or resist what the drug was doing. There was the woman who took Dexedrine for 3 months, lost the weight the doctor had targeted, felt well, and discontinued the prescription without difficulty. She is in the data too, and her experience is not negligible. The drug did what it was supposed to do, in the short term, and she did not experience the long-term complications that others did, because her timeline was short enough to avoid them. From inside her experience, the prescribing was a success. There was the woman who took it for 6 months, and found, on discontinuation, a 2-week period of difficulty followed by a return to baseline. She would not have described this as withdrawal, because the word was not available to her in the context of her own prescription. She would have described it as feeling a bit off for a couple of weeks after stopping, which was true and which she managed and which resolved. Her experience, too, is in the aggregate, pulling the numbers in the direction of the manageable. There was the woman who took it for 4 years, and whose experience was the one described in this story at some length. The morning tablet, the productive Tuesday, the sleep that came late, and the mind that did not quiet easily, and then the gradual recognition that the drug had become something different from what it had started as. Not a tool she used, but a condition her day required. Her experience was also in the aggregate, and it is the experience that the regulatory history was eventually responding to when the 1970 Act placed amphetamines in Schedule 2. There was the woman who was prescribed Dexedrine in 1960, and who, by 1968, was taking 3 times the prescribed dose and obtaining supplemental supplies through a second doctor she had found who did not know about the first. She appears in the literature not under her name but in the category of prescription drug misuse, and her story is told in the medical case reports as a cautionary example. What the case reports do not record is what else was happening in her life in 1968, what pressures the drug was managing, what the alternative looked like to her, what she understood about what was happening and what she did not. The variety of experiences within the aggregate is important not because it complicates the policy conclusion. It probably doesn't, or doesn't much, because the policy response was aimed at the cases that were causing the most harm, and those cases were real and significant. But because it complicates the moral conclusion. The Dexedrine era is not a story about women who are naive or weak or foolish. It is a story about women who are responding, in reasonable and individual ways, to an information environment that was giving them incomplete and partially misleading information, within a cultural context that was defining their bodies as problems requiring solutions, managed by a healthcare system that was providing solutions without adequate consideration of their full consequences. Some women recognized what was happening to them sooner than others. Some had doctors who were more attentive or more knowledgeable. Some had social circumstances that made it easier to stop. Households where the husband noticed and cared. Communities where the conversation was happening. Lives with enough flexibility to accommodate the difficult weeks of discontinuation without the whole structure collapsing. Some did not have these things. In the towns and cities where the prescribing was most dense, the suburban communities of the Northeast and the Midwest and the Southeast, where the ranch houses were new and the neighborhood was young, and the women were home all day with children under school age and houses that required constant maintenance and the particular pressure of the 1950s domestic ideal sitting on them like a visible, unacknowledged weight, the drug found its most consistent market. There is a phrase that appears in several of the oral histories collected by researchers of this period, varied in its specific formulation but consistent in its meaning. I think most of the women in my neighborhood were taking something. The something was usually Dexedrine, though by the mid-1960s it might have been another formulation, or Milltown, the tranquilizer that had its own era of mass prescribing in the late 1950s, or the benzodiazepines that were arriving as Milltown's successors, or some combination. The point the phrase makes is about the universality of the pharmaceutical management of women's daily lives in this era, the normalization of the prescription as the response to the discomforts of a life structured in particular ways. The Rolling Stones named a song about this in 1966. Mother's Little Helper was not, when it was released, understood as a song about amphetamines. It was understood as being about tranquilizers, specifically the benzodiazepine Valium, which had been released in 1963 and which had its own trajectory of mass prescribing to women that paralleled and eventually succeeded the amphetamine era. The song's observation that the little yellow pill helped the mother get through her day, that getting through the day required pharmaceutical assistance, that this was an irony worth noting, landed in the culture with the kind of wry recognition that humour produces when it identifies something that was there all along but hadn't been named. The Stones were not writing a feminist critique exactly. They were writing a pop song with an edge. But the observation at the centre of it was accurate, and the accuracy was its own kind of critique, available to anyone who wanted to receive it that way. The women who were taking Mother's Little Helper knew, on some level, that the song was about them. Some of them found this uncomfortable. Some found it funny in the same complex way that the neighbour's refill story was funny. The laugh that has something else in it. Something more specific than amusement. Some found it clarifying, a moment when something they had been experiencing without language found a form. The language arrived gradually, the way language for new things always arrives, sideways through the accumulation of partial attempts, through the metaphors that approximate the thing before the exact word shows up. Women talked to each other. Women talked to the researchers who came looking. Women wrote, when they wrote about this at all, in terms that circled around something they could feel more clearly than they could name. The name that arrived eventually, dependence, and then in the popular press addiction, and then in the more careful accounts of the 1980s and 1990s, the more specific language of a long-term amphetamine use and its discontinuation effects, came too late to do much good for the women who had been through it. The naming was useful for the record. It was useful for the policy history. It was useful perhaps for the daughters of those women, who grew up in households where the thing had happened and who carried some knowledge of it forward, imperfectly, into their own encounters with the pharmaceutical management of female experience. The daughters of the Dexedrine generation were the women of the 1980s and 1990s who watched the Fen-Phen era unfold. Some of them recognized something in it. Some of them took the pills. The wheel turned. The grandmother who had carried the amber bottle in her handbag, who had lived through the difficult 2 years, who had not been told what was happening. She was in the house. Sometimes she talked about it. More often she didn't. The kitchen where she had taken the morning tablet was still the same kitchen, or it had been remodeled, or it had been sold to another family, but the neighbourhood was the same neighbourhood, and the morning light came through the windows at the same angle. What she understood by the time she was in her 60s and the researcher from Ohio State came to interview her was something clear and simple and hard-won. She understood that the system that had given her the prescription had not been thinking about her. It had been thinking about a version of her, an abstraction, a market, a body that required management, a source of pharmaceutical revenue. She was a particular person with a particular life, and the prescription had treated her as a category. She did not say this with bitterness particularly. She said it with the equanimity of someone who has had 30 years to arrive at a perspective. She was not asking for an apology. The industry would not have given her one in any case. What she was, at 73, was clear. Clear about what had happened. Clear about how long it had taken to see it. Clear that her daughters should know the pattern so they could see it when it arrived in their time. Whether the daughters had heard her is another question, and one that the researcher did not ask. Valium arrived in 1963. The timing was not accidental, in the sense that nothing about the pharmaceutical market of the early 1960s was accidental. The Dexedrine era was beginning to attract regulatory attention. The Kefauver hearings had generated scrutiny. The thalidomide crisis had sensitized the public to the idea that pharmaceutical confidence was not the same as pharmaceutical safety. And into this slightly more cautious atmosphere came diazepam, trade name Valium from Hoffmann-La Roche, in the small yellow 5mg tablet that would become one of the most prescribed drugs in American history. Valium was a benzodiazepine, a class of drugs that acted on the gamma-aminobutyric acid system, the brain's primary inhibitory neurotransmitter system, to produce anxiolysis, or the reduction of anxiety, along with sedation, muscle relaxation, and anticonvulsant effects. The mechanism was well characterized by the time of approval. The effects were real and clinically useful. The drug worked. It also, it turned out, produced physical dependence with long-term use and a withdrawal syndrome on discontinuation that was in some respects more severe than the amphetamine withdrawal that had been the concern of the previous era. Benzodiazepine withdrawal in long-term users could produce anxiety, insomnia, irritability, muscle tension, sweating, tremor, and in some cases, particularly in high-dose users who stopped abruptly, seizures. The seizure risk was not theoretical. It was documented and it was dangerous. The prescribing of Valium followed a trajectory that is now recognizable from the earlier story. It was initially prescribed for genuine and severe anxiety. It was then extended through the same mechanisms of pharmaceutical marketing and physician education and detail man visits to the milder anxieties of everyday life. The nervousness, the restlessness, the difficulty managing the demands of the domestic role, the tension in the body that accumulates from years of doing things that are not acknowledged as work and yet produce the same physical and emotional signs of strain. By 1978, diazepam was the most prescribed drug in the world. By some estimates, more than 2 billion tablets were prescribed annually in the United States in the mid-1970s. The patients were predominantly women. The prescribers were predominantly men. The pattern from the Dexedrine era had not changed in its essential structure. A drug that addressed a genuine complaint, defined in pharmaceutical terms, and prescribed to a population defined partly by their gender and the cultural expectations attached to it, without adequate attention to the consequences of long-term use. The women who took Valium in the 1960s and 1970s were not mostly the women who had taken Dexedrine in the 1950s, but they were the same generation, or its successors, navigating the same basic terrain, the gap between the domestic ideal and the domestic reality, the gap between what the culture asked of women and what the women had available to give it, the gap that the culture dressed in medical language and the medical profession filled with prescriptions. The term overprescribing was beginning to enter the conversation by the mid-1970s, applied initially to narcotics, and then more broadly to the class of drugs that were being prescribed in large quantities to women for conditions that had plausible non-pharmaceutical explanations. The conversation was not simple, the conditions were real, the distress was real, and there were women who found the drugs genuinely helpful, and who resented the suggestion that their prescriptions were inappropriate. The complexity was the same complexity that attaches to all such conversations, because the individual's experience and the population-level pattern are not the same thing, and the drug that helps one person is also the drug that harms another. A Senate subcommittee hearing in 1979, chaired by Senator Edward Kennedy, examined the prescribing of tranquilizers to women. The hearing generated testimony about the patterns of prescribing, about the role of pharmaceutical marketing in driving those patterns, about the gap between what the prescribing information said about long-term use and what was happening in practice. A representative from the National Institute on Drug Abuse testified that women were prescribed tranquilizers at roughly twice the rate of men, that this disparity was not explained by differences in the prevalence of the conditions the drugs treated, and that the prescribing reflected, at least in part, a tendency in the medical profession to manage women's complaints with pharmaceuticals rather than investigating their causes. The hearing did not produce immediate reform. Senate subcommittee hearings rarely do, in the sense of producing immediate reform. What they produce is a record, an acknowledgement that the thing is visible, a moment in the public conversation that can be referenced later when the conversation returns to the same ground. The conversation returned to the same ground many times in the following decades. The anxiety medication era of the 1980s and 1990s, the SSRIs, the selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, beginning with fluoxetine, trade name Prozac, in 1987, brought a new class of drugs into the same basic market dynamic. Prozac was prescribed in large quantities to women. It was effective for depression, and for the anxiety disorders it was eventually also approved for. It was also prescribed for conditions that were less clearly within its indication, for the social anxiety that might have been better addressed through cognitive behavioral therapy, for the grief that might have been a normal response to loss rather than a clinical depression, for the premenstrual syndrome that was now formalized as premenstrual dysphoric disorder when a formulation of fluoxetine was marketed specifically for it. The details changed, the structure did not, and the women in the waiting rooms received the prescriptions and carried the bottles home and took the pills in the morning and managed their days with pharmaceutical assistance, and some of them found it helpful and some of them found it something else, and the something else continued to accumulate in the research literature and in the anecdotes and in the quiet conversations that women had with each other when they were trying to figure out what they actually thought. What they actually thought, across the decades, is harder to recover than what they were told. The told is well documented, in the pharmaceutical archives, in the medical journals, in the prescribing records, in the advertising of which there is a great deal. The thought is in the journals and the letters and the oral histories and the conversations that were not recorded, and it is recoverable only in fragments. The fragments suggest ambivalence. They suggest women who were genuinely helped by the drugs and also genuinely complicated by them, who found relief in the prescriptions and also found something else, something harder to name, a displacement of their experience into pharmaceutical terms, a tendency to manage through medication what might otherwise have been managed through the transformation of the conditions producing the distress. Betty Friedan's problem that had no name found its pharmaceutical solution, and the solution was real and not real at the same time. It addressed the distress without addressing its source, which is what pharmaceutical solutions do, which is sometimes enough and sometimes not, which is a distinction that the pharmaceutical industry has a structural interest in not making too clear. In 2026, the SSRI prescription is common, familiar, and widely accepted as a first-line treatment for depression and anxiety in women. The GLP-1 prescription is new and rapidly growing, and surrounded by the particular combination of enthusiasm and uncertainty that attaches to new interventions. The Sunscreen and vitamin D supplement sit side by side on the bathroom shelf. The waiting room chair is more comfortable. The structure is the same structure. The women in it are somewhat better informed, somewhat more likely to ask the question that the 11 minutes cannot fully answer. Somewhat. The progress is real. It is also partial, and the partial is the part that requires continued attention. The story of sunscreen and vitamin D is not the same story for all women. It is a story that differs significantly by skin tone, by latitude, by the specific history of who was included in the public health messaging and whose experience was centered when the guidance was developed. Human skin pigmentation is a biological adaptation to UV radiation, one of the most directly observable examples of evolutionary selection visible in the human species. Darker skin contains more and larger melanosomes, the cellular structures that produce and distribute melanin, and this additional melanin provides greater protection against UV-induced DNA damage. It is not absolute protection, but it is significant. Dark skin has an effective SPF estimated in the range of 8 to 15, compared to fair skin's effective SPF of approximately 3. This is why melanoma is far more common in lighter-skinned populations, and why the skin cancer messaging that drove sunscreen adoption was developed primarily in the context of light-skinned patients and communities. The same melanin that provides greater UV protection also reduces the rate of vitamin D synthesis. Darker skin requires significantly more sun exposure to produce the same amount of vitamin D as lighter skin under the same conditions. Studies comparing vitamin D synthesis rates across skin tones find that darker-skinned individuals may require 3 to 5 times more sun exposure to produce equivalent amounts of vitamin D. This is a significant difference, particularly in populations that live at higher latitudes where UVB intensity is already limited for much of the year. The implications of this are measurable in population-level data. Vitamin D deficiency rates in the United States are highest in Black Americans, followed by Hispanic Americans and then Asian Americans, with the lowest rates in non-Hispanic white Americans. The pattern holds even after controlling for factors like socioeconomic status and access to healthcare, and it is explained primarily by the interaction between skin pigmentation and latitude. Darker-skinned people living at northern latitudes have the hardest time synthesizing adequate vitamin D from sun exposure alone. This is not a problem that sunscreen caused, in the sense that dark-skinned people in northern climates face a vitamin D challenge that exists independently of sunscreen use and is driven primarily by the mismatch between their skin's evolved adaptation and the latitude where they live. The melanin that protected their ancestors from the intense sun of equatorial and subequatorial regions becomes, at 40 degrees north, a factor that reduces vitamin D synthesis precisely when the available UV is already limited. But the sunscreen messaging has not always acknowledged this. The broad public health recommendation to use sunscreen daily was developed in the context of skin cancer prevention, and skin cancer is predominantly a concern for lighter-skinned populations. The advice to use high SPF sunscreen as a daily skincare step did not typically come with a discussion of how this advice applied differently to people with different skin tones, or with a clear statement that vitamin D supplementation was particularly important for darker-skinned people living at northern latitudes. The dermatology profession has been predominantly composed of lighter-skinned practitioners in the United States, a fact that has consequences for whose experiences and whose risk profiles are centered in the development of clinical guidelines. This is not a unique problem to dermatology, but it is present in dermatology, and it has consequences for the quality of guidance received by patients of different backgrounds. Skin of color dermatology is a recognized subspecialty that has grown substantially since the 1990s, bringing increased attention to the ways in which dermatological conditions present differently in darker skin, and to the specific clinical needs of patients who have been underrepresented in both the research and the clinical training. The subspecialty has also brought more nuanced attention to the sunscreen question as it applies to patients with darker skin. The question of how to balance the real but different risk of skin cancer in this population against the significant and well-documented risk of vitamin D deficiency. For a black woman in Chicago, the calculation looks different from the calculation for a white woman in Miami. The Chicago woman has a low baseline risk of melanoma, lower effective UV penetration due to melanin, lower baseline vitamin D synthesis due to the combination of melanin and latitude, and a high latitude climate that limits useful UVB exposure for roughly 5 months of the year. The Miami woman has a higher melanoma risk, less UV protection from melanin, and year-round UVB availability that makes dietary supplementation a less urgent necessity. The simple message, use sunscreen daily, applied to both women equally is not equally appropriate advice. The Chicago woman probably needs more sun exposure and more aggressive supplementation and less concern about the SPF number on her daily moisturizer than the Miami woman. The message she has been receiving from public health campaigns and dermatological guidelines does not make these distinctions clearly. Research has consistently found that darker-skinned patients receive less dermatological advice about sun protection, a finding that is sometimes interpreted optimistically as evidence that clinicians are appropriately calibrating advice to risk, and sometimes interpreted as evidence of healthcare disparities that darker-skinned patients are receiving less thorough counselling. Both interpretations may be partly correct, and the resolution between them depends on whether the counselling that is being provided is calibrated to the full picture, including vitamin D risk, or simply reflects the lower priority given to lighter-skinned skin cancer concerns in a different patient population. The history of medical research has not served all populations equally. The clinical trials that established the evidence base for sunscreen efficacy were conducted predominantly in lighter-skinned subjects. The vitamin D research has a broader demographic range, but the samples that established the deficiency thresholds and the supplementation recommendations were not always representative of the full population in the ways that would allow the most precise calibration of advice for different groups. These are solvable problems, and progress has been made. The diversity of clinical research has improved substantially since the 1990s, driven by regulatory requirements, advocacy, and a growing recognition in the research community that homogeneous samples limit the generalizability of findings. The guidance on skin of colour has become more nuanced. The awareness that vitamin D deficiency is a particular concern in darker-skinned populations at higher latitudes has entered mainstream clinical practice. It has not fully entered the waiting room poster, which still tends to show the broad-brimmed hat and the long-sleeve shirt, without much discussion of who the advice is for and what that person's specific risk profile might be. The women in the waiting rooms are not all the same woman. They sit in the same chairs in waiting rooms that look increasingly similar as the medical office park has become its own architectural idiom across the country. But their bodies have different histories, different melanin concentrations, different relationships to the sun and to the latitude where they live. The advice they receive should reflect this. The advice is getting better at reflecting it. It is not yet as good as it should be. The story of sunscreen and vitamin D is not yet finished being told, in the same way that the story of amphetamines and women is not finished being told. The telling is ongoing, the evidence is accumulating, the understanding is imperfect and improving. The women in the waiting rooms deserve the best current version of a complicated truth, delivered with the acknowledgement that the current version is incomplete and will be revised, and that the revision is not a failure of medicine, but the nature of science applied to living bodies in a world that keeps offering new information. The afternoon light comes through the window at the angle it comes through windows at this time of day. It is UV radiation moving at the speed of light from a star 8 minutes away. It has been making this journey for as long as there have been women sitting in chairs and waiting for advice about it. The advice is still catching up. In the winter of 2022, a particular word started appearing in conversations that had not previously contained it. The word was Ozempic, and it was moving through the culture with the speed that a thing moves when it has found a ready audience, when the thing being named is something the audience has been waiting, perhaps without knowing it, for someone to name. Ozempic was not new. Semaglutide, the molecule marketed as Ozempic, had been approved by the FDA in 2017 for the management of type 2 diabetes. It had been on the market for 5 years, and had been unremarkable in the pharmaceutical landscape until it wasn't. What changed was not the drug, but the conversation about it. Specifically, the conversation that began when it became apparent that people taking semaglutide for diabetes were losing substantial amounts of weight as a side effect, and that the weight loss was of a magnitude not previously achieved by any approved pharmaceutical. The trials for the obesity formulation of the drug, Wegovy, approved in 2021, showed weight loss of 15% of body weight on average. Some participants lost 20% or more. These numbers were genuinely different from what had been achievable before in a class that had been accustomed to modest results and modest ambitions. The drug worked in the sense that it produced the outcome the field was measuring. The mechanism was also different from previous weight loss drugs. GLP-1 agonists are not stimulants. They do not suppress appetite through amphetamine-like action on the central nervous system. They work by mimicking a hormone, glucagon-like peptide one, that is released from the gut after eating and that signals satiety to the brain, slows gastric emptying, and modulates the release of insulin. People taking GLP-1 agonists do not typically describe the experience as speedy or energizing in the way that women in the Dexedrine era described their prescriptions. They describe instead a reduction in what has been called food noise, the persistent background preoccupation with food, with the next meal, with the management of appetite, that many people experience as simply the texture of everyday consciousness until it stops. The food noise description is interesting, not only for what it says about the drug's effect, but for what it says about the experience it is interrupting. Many people who take GLP-1 agonists describe the cessation of food noise as revelatory, as the discovery that other people apparently do not think about food the way they always had, that the hunger and the appetite management and the constant low-level negotiation with food was not universal but was instead something about their particular biology, now addressable. This is a powerful experience, and the reports of it are genuine. The question that hovers over these reports, the question that the Dexedrine era teaches us to ask, is whether the food noise being interrupted was entirely a biological problem, or whether it was also a response to the food environment, to the hyper-palatable processed foods that dominate the American diet, to the specific nutritional and metabolic context of living in a body in 2023 surrounded by foods engineered to produce continuous desire. The obesity researcher Michael Goran and his colleagues have documented that the modern food environment, the ultra-processed foods that constitute an estimated 58% of American caloric intake, produces metabolic effects that are distinct from the effects of less processed foods with similar macronutrient profiles, including effects on satiety signaling and appetite regulation. The food environment of 2023 is, by some measures, designed to override the satiety signals that GLP-1 and other gut hormones produce. The GLP-1 drug, in this framing, is an intervention that restores the satiety signaling that the food environment is undermining, which is somewhat different from saying it is treating a disease of metabolism, and somewhat more like saying it is a pharmaceutical correction to an environmental problem. This distinction does not make the drug wrong to use. If the environment is producing a metabolic dysfunction, and a drug corrects that dysfunction, the drug is appropriate regardless of the source of the dysfunction. But it suggests that the drug is addressing a symptom of a broader condition that the drug will not cure, and that discontinuing the drug will return the person to the environment that produced the symptom in the first place, which is what the discontinuation studies show, and which the industry is not for grounding in its marketing. The marketing of GLP-1 drugs is sophisticated and, in its broad outlines, recognizable. The drugs are presented as treatments for a chronic disease, obesity, formerly classified as a disease by the AMA in 2013, rather than as lifestyle interventions. The patients are not morally deficient. They have a biological condition that responds to a biological treatment. The prescription is appropriate medical care. The long-term use is indicated because the disease is chronic. The narrative is assembled from the same materials as the Dexedrine narrative, updated for the cultural moment. The cultural moment is different from 1960 in significant ways, and the differences matter. The patients taking GLP-1 drugs are making more informed choices than the women who took Dexedrine, in the sense that more information is available, more patient advocacy exists, more public discourse about pharmaceutical marketing has taken place in the intervening 60 years. They are also making choices under conditions that include celebrity endorsements of the drugs that dwarf anything the pharmaceutical industry of the 1950s was capable of producing in a media environment that can amplify a weight loss narrative to 100 million people in a week. The celebrity endorsement of weight loss drugs is a phenomenon that recurs across the history, with enough regularity that it has its own section in any serious history of pharmaceutical marketing. In the late 1950s and early 1960s, the celebrity endorsement was implicit. The thin women in the magazines, the actresses whose maintained figures were aspirational, the cultural visibility of thinness as the proof of good management. In the Fen-Phen era, celebrity use was discussed in entertainment media. In the Ozempic era, public figures discussed their use openly on social media platforms with audiences in the tens of millions, and the discussion produced both the normalization of the drug and a demand that the pharmaceutical companies could not immediately satisfy. The shortage of semaglutide that developed in 2022 and 2023 was a direct result of demand that exceeded the production capacity the companies had planned for, which they had planned for based on the diabetes market, not the obesity market, not the celebrity-endorsed obesity market. The shortage produced its own complications. Patients with type 2 diabetes who needed the drug for its approved indication were competing with patients using it off-label for obesity, and the competition produced actual shortages of a drug that was, for the diabetes patients, a first-line treatment rather than an optional one. The regulatory and insurance landscape around GLP-1 drugs for obesity is still evolving. Insurance coverage is inconsistent. Many insurers cover the drugs for type 2 diabetes but not for obesity without diabetes, at costs that run to several $100s per month out of pocket, which places them outside the reach of a significant portion of the population that might benefit from them. The question of who gets access to effective weight loss pharmaceuticals and who pays for them has an equity dimension that echoes the Dexedrine era in some respects and differs in others. In the Dexedrine era, the drug was inexpensive and widely accessible to those with insurance. It was the kind of drug that cost a few dollars per prescription, prescribed by your own doctor in the consultation where you discussed your weight. The equity problem of that era was about who was targeted by the marketing and whose bodies were defined as problems requiring pharmaceutical solutions, not about access to the treatment. In the GLP-1 era, the drug is expensive and access is uneven, and the equity question is reversed. The drug exists and is effective, and the question is who can afford it. These are different problems with different solutions and different stakes, and they share the underlying structure of a pharmaceutical market operating in the space of body management and the management of female appetite, with the same fundamental question unanswered. What does it mean to treat, with a drug, a condition that is partly physiological and partly the product of an environment and a culture? The amber bottle on the counter in 1960, the prescription pump injector in the bathroom cabinet in 2024. Both are part of the same story, even though the story has changed in almost every particular. The story is still being told, the telling is still incomplete. The women in the waiting rooms are still waiting. The body wants to sleep. This is one of the oldest facts about the body, older than Dexedrine and older than Sunscreen and older than the waiting room with its faded walls and its prescription pad. The body has been sleeping for as long as there have been bodies, and sleep is not a rest from the body's work but a form of the body's work. The period of consolidation, repair, memory processing, immune surveillance, hormonal regulation that makes the waking hours possible. Sleep is the period during which cortisol drops to its lowest level, the stress hormone that drives alertness and readiness, and the capacity to manage a day's worth of demands settles into its nocturnal minimum, and the body takes the opportunity to do what stress chemistry prevents: cell repair, protein synthesis, the housekeeping of the immune system, the consolidation of the day's experiences into the structures of long-term memory. Amphetamines interfered with sleep. This is documented unsurprisingly in the research literature, and it was part of the phenomenology that the women of the Dexedrine era described: the lying awake with a mind that did not slow as fast as the body would have liked, the sleep that came eventually but not with the depth, or the restoration of sleep before the prescription. Some women found that taking the tablet later in the day was a mistake that would cost them the night. Some found that the nighttime quality of rest declined over months in ways they attributed to other causes. The amphetamine disruption of sleep was not primarily a concern in the prescribing literature of the era, for the same reasons that many things about the long-term effects of the drug were not primary concerns. The focus was on the target effect, on the weight loss, on the appetite suppression that was the stated clinical goal. The side effects that were documented, increased heart rate, elevated blood pressure, the sleep disruption, the mood effects, were generally described as manageable and were not foregrounded in the patient communication that was happening in the 11-minute consultation. Sleep is now understood, in ways that it was not in 1960, to be a central component of metabolic health. The research connecting sleep deprivation to weight gain, to insulin resistance, to the disruption of the appetite-regulating hormones leptin and ghrelin is substantial and well established. A person who is sleeping poorly is a person whose appetite regulation is impaired, whose food choices tend toward higher calorie options, whose metabolic efficiency is reduced. The sleep disruption produced by amphetamines was, from a metabolic health perspective, working against the weight loss the amphetamines were prescribed to produce. This is a particularly vivid example of the off-target effects that the system thinking missing from the prescribing era would have caught. The drug produces appetite suppression and produces sleep disruption. The sleep disruption produces appetite dysregulation. The net effect on weight management over the long term is complicated by the interaction of these effects in ways that the short-term trial data, the 12 weeks that ended before the interaction became fully visible, did not capture. The GLP-1 drugs appear to improve sleep in some patients, which is an interesting finding and one that the research is still trying to understand. The mechanism may involve the weight loss itself, which reduces the risk of sleep apnea and other weight-related sleep disorders. It may also involve direct effects of GLP-1 signaling in the brain regions that regulate sleep and circadian rhythms. The data is preliminary but directionally interesting. A drug that both reduces appetite and improves sleep would be metabolically coherent in ways that the amphetamine was not. The vitamin D connection to sleep is also emerging in the research. Vitamin D receptors are present in areas of the brain involved in sleep regulation, including the hypothalamus and the structures that manage the circadian rhythm. Studies have found associations between low vitamin D levels and poor sleep quality, increased insomnia, shorter sleep duration, and less time in deep sleep stages. Supplementation studies have produced mixed results, some showing improvement in sleep parameters with vitamin D supplementation, others showing no significant effect. The relationship is probably real, but the mechanism and the magnitude of the effect are still being characterized. What the sleep research adds to the vitamin D story is another argument for adequate vitamin D that goes beyond bone health and immune function. The possibility that the reduction in vitamin D levels associated with decreased sun exposure and comprehensive sunscreen use has contributed at the margin to the population-level decline in sleep quality that has been documented over the same period. The causal chain here is long and uncertain, and there are many other factors contributing to the sleep quality decline: screen time, light at night, work schedule changes, the extension of the active day through artificial light. Vitamin D is one factor among many. The body at the end of the day wants to settle. The cortisol has been managing the day, organizing the response to each demand, and as the afternoon light changes quality, as the blue spectrum light that suppresses melatonin diminishes and the warmer spectrum of evening takes over, the cortisol should begin its nocturnal decline, and the melatonin should begin its rise, and the body should begin the long journey towards sleep. This is the ancient pattern. The sun sets, the body prepares for sleep, the night does its work. The pattern is old enough that it has been encoded in the circadian machinery, in the rhythms of hormone secretion and body temperature that operate on roughly a 24-hour cycle, and are entrained to the light-dark cycle through the light that falls on the retina and travels to the suprachiasmatic nucleus, the central circadian clock, located in the hypothalamus, the size of a grain of rice, ancient beyond measure. The modern disruptions of this pattern are many. Artificial light at night, particularly the blue spectrum light of screens, suppresses melatonin and delays sleep onset. Indoor daytime environments that provide insufficient bright light during the day reduce the amplitude of the circadian rhythm, making the contrast between day and night less sharp and the sleep pressure less effective. The net result, in people living modern indoor lives, is often a circadian rhythm that is somewhat flattened and somewhat delayed, producing both more difficulty falling asleep at night and more difficulty waking and achieving alertness in the morning. Outdoor light exposure during the day, and specifically the bright spectrally full light of outdoor daylight, helps to set and maintain the circadian rhythm. This is one of the mechanisms through which regular outdoor time supports sleep quality, and it is one of the reasons that the relationship between sun exposure and health extends beyond vitamin D synthesis and UV-induced nitric oxide release. The chronobiological benefit of daylight is real and is being researched, and it is another argument for the value of outdoor time that is not captured in the simple message about sunscreen. The woman in the darkened bedroom settling towards sleep carries in her the history of all of this without knowing most of it. She carries the circadian machinery that evolved in dialogue with the sun. She carries the vitamin D her skin produced or did not produce, the supplement she took or did not take, the decisions she made in the morning about protection and exposure. She carries the hormones that are doing their nightly work, the melatonin rising, the cortisol settling, the growth hormone that peaks in early sleep, the leptin that will regulate her morning appetite. She carries too whatever she has been prescribed, whatever pharmaceutical the day's consultation produced, whatever the amber bottle or the pump injector or the white tablet on the nightstand contains. The body metabolizes it while she sleeps, or cannot metabolize it and holds it for morning, or has become accustomed to it in ways that are not fully visible to her. The house settles around her. The refrigerator hums. The street outside is quieter than it was at noon. The particular silence of a neighborhood at night, the absence of children, of traffic, of the ambient industry of the day, has a texture that the body recognizes as its proper element, the darkness that is right for sleeping. The thoughts that come at the edge of sleep are different from the thoughts of the waking day. They are looser, less purposive, more given to association, a waiting room, the smell of floor wax, the sound of a pen on paper, a bottle on a counter catching the light. The morning of a decade she read about or heard about or half remembers from something her mother mentioned once in passing and did not explain. The explanation is in the history. The history is long and complicated and still being assembled. The night is quiet and the body is settling, and the explanation can wait until morning when there is light again. There is a particular kind of knowledge that lives in the body rather than the mind. Not the knowledge that can be recalled on request, retrieved from the shelf of memory and examined in the light, but the knowledge that is held in the tissue, in the way the body responds to certain stimuli, in the patterns of appetite and sleep, and the particular quality of an afternoon in a decade that is not this decade, but that the body has not entirely stopped being in. The women who lived through the Dexedrine era carry knowledge of this kind, the ones who are still living. The knowledge is about what the drug did, which is partly a thing that can be described in words and partly a thing that is below words, held in the body's memory of how it felt to be under the influence of a particular chemistry for years, and then to not be, and then to reorganize slowly around the absence. Body memory is a concept that has had variable reception in the scientific literature, where it sometimes refers to implicit motor memory, the learning in the muscles that allows the practice pianist to play without consciously recalling the fingering, and sometimes refers to something vaguer and more controversial, the idea that traumatic or transformative experiences leave traces in the body's functioning that persist beyond what the explicit memory system retains. The Dexedrine experience is not exactly either of these things, but it is not entirely unrelated to the second. A woman who took Dexedrine for 10 years and then stopped has a body that spent a decade calibrated to a specific neurochemical environment, a sustained upregulation of dopamine and norepinephrine, the neurotransmitters that amphetamines work on, which are the neurotransmitters of motivation, attention, reward, and energy. The body does not simply spring back to its pre-pharmaceutical baseline when the drug is removed. It recalibrates over time, and the recalibration is generally successful. The body is remarkably capable of restoring its own regulatory homeostasis. But the recalibration takes time, and during that time the body exists in a kind of transitional state that is neither what it was before nor what it will be after. 50 years later, the body has completed its recalibration. The nervous system has long since settled back into whatever patterns were its own before the prescription, or into the patterns of an aged version of that self, modified by time and experience and the ongoing negotiation with the world that aging requires. The Dexedrine is not in the body anymore, not measurably. But the pattern of the decade is in the memory, accessible in the way that procedural memory is accessible. Not always as a narrative, not always as a sequence of events that can be told in order, but as a texture, a quality, a sense of how things felt in a particular period of life that is different from how they felt before and after. The woman being interviewed by the researcher from Ohio State is in her 70s. She is clear-eyed. She has a good memory. She can tell the story of the prescription, the years of taking it, the discontinuation. What she is less able to articulate is what those years felt like from the inside, not the events of them, but the phenomenology, the texture of consciousness under the sustained influence of a drug that modified the chemistry of awareness itself. This is the part of the history that is hardest to recover, and it matters because it is the part that the women who were living it knew best, and that the medical record contains least. The prescription records show what was written and when, and in what quantity. The pharmaceutical company archives show what was sold and how much and to whom in aggregate. The medical literature shows what the trials demonstrated and what the case reports described, and what the editorials concluded. None of this shows what it was like to be a woman in 1963 taking her morning tablet and standing at the kitchen window with the coffee growing cold and the children not yet awake, and the particular quality of that moment. History is full of this gap. The experience of lived life is always partly recoverable and always partly lost. What is recoverable tends to be what was written down, and what was written down tends to be what seemed important to write down, and what seemed important to write down tends to be what was already within the frame of what the culture considered important. The experience of women in the interior of their domestic lives, in the years when the domestic interior was the entire scope of what their lives were culturally acknowledged to be, was not within the frame. It was happening abundantly, in millions of kitchens and waiting rooms and bedrooms. It was being experienced fully and particularly. It was not being recorded, except in the pharmaceutical sales figures, and in the journals that some women kept, and in the letters that some women wrote, and in the conversations that happened over the back fence or on the telephone in the late morning. The letters are the most vivid part of what survives. There is a collection at a university library, letters written between two women who were neighbours in a suburb of Cleveland in the 1950s and 1960s, who maintained their correspondence after one moved to Phoenix, whose letters cover the full domestic texture of their decades: children, husbands, houses, health, the small agitations and satisfactions of daily life. The letters do not explicitly discuss Dexedrine. The word does not appear. But there is a period, beginning in the early 1960s, when the woman in Phoenix begins to describe a particular quality of energy and efficiency that she attributes to a new prescription from her doctor, and a period several years later when she describes feeling, as she puts it, rather flat for some months, which she attributes to stopping the prescription because the doctor felt it was time. The flat months are described with the restraint of someone who does not have a word for what she's experiencing and does not want to dwell on something she cannot quite explain. The letters from this period are slightly shorter than usual, slightly less detailed in their descriptions of the daily round. Then they resume their previous character, and she is herself again, or a version of herself that has come through something and arrived somewhere. The woman in Cleveland wrote back with sympathy, and sent a recipe for something and mentioned that her own doctor had said similar things and that she had found it a bit difficult as well for a while. And then the conversation moved on, as conversations do, to the next thing and the next and the next, and the next thing and the next and the next. The decades pass in the letters with the speed that decades have when you're inside them. Each individual day slow and specific, the months and years fast in retrospect. The children grow up, the husbands retire, the grandchildren arrive, the kitchens get remodeled, the neighbourhood changes. The amber bottles are in a drawer somewhere, or have been disposed of, or have been forgotten. The pharmaceutical company that made them has been acquired and reacquired and renamed. The drug is still available, still prescribed, still part of the pharmacological toolkit, though prescribed now for different conditions and with different regulatory controls and different monitoring requirements. It is Schedule II. It requires a special prescription form. The refill is not automatic. The women who wrote those letters are in their 90s, if they are living. The letters are in the archive. The history is recoverable up to a point in the records that exist and in the gaps between them where the lived experience was. The lived experience was there. It is partially recoverable. It is worth the effort of recovery, not as a cautionary tale, but as a way of knowing something that the pharmaceutical record, the regulatory history and the medical literature do not contain. The knowledge of what it was like to be in those years, in those bodies, with that chemistry, in that culture. The knowledge is worth having. It is part of what we are doing when we look at this history, which is not primarily forensic and not primarily accusatory, but is, at its most useful, an attempt to understand the full shape of what happened, so that the shape that is currently forming is visible a little sooner. There is a particular quality that comes with having looked at something for a long time, not the quality of having resolved it. Some things do not resolve, and the stories that persist in history are often the ones that refuse resolution, that hold their complexity against the pressure to simplify. But the quality of having become familiar with the shape of the thing, with its texture, with the way it sits in the world. The history of pharmaceutical prescribing to women, which is the history this story has been living inside, has this quality when you have spent time with it. It is not resolved. It is still ongoing in the waiting rooms and the pharmaceutical boardrooms and the Senate subcommittee hearings and the dermatology offices and the endocrinology consultations and the social media feeds where someone is describing what Ozempic feels like and someone else is warning about what it might do and someone else is noting that the someone describing and the someone warning both have interests that shape their accounts. The story is ongoing, and it is also very old, and the oldness is part of what gives it its particular quality. You can trace it back past Dexedrine, past the patent medicines of the late 19th century, with their opiates and their cocaine, past the tonics and the elixirs and the moral therapies of the Victorian era, past the bloodletting and the purging that preceded them, all the way back to the ancient and persistent human desire to improve the body through intervention, to correct what seems wrong, to enhance what seems insufficient. The desire is not pathological, it is human. The body is a remarkable instrument and also a limited one, and the desire to push past the limits, to correct the deviations, to improve the experience of inhabiting it. This desire is written very deep. It is not going away. The pharmaceutical industry did not create it. The pharmaceutical industry found it and commercialized it, which is a different thing. What the pharmaceutical industry did create, or at least shape significantly, is the particular form that the desire takes in modern culture. The medically framed, prescription-mediated, insurance-reimbursable form in which the desire to modify the body is translated into a clinical encounter that produces a pharmaceutical intervention with regulatory approval and a detailed profile of efficacy claims. The translation is useful in many respects. It brings real science to bear. It creates accountability structures. It produces interventions that are, in many cases, effective. It also consistently produces the pattern that this story has been tracing, the foregrounding of the benefit, the backgrounding of the trade-off, the definition of the problem in pharmaceutical terms, the creation of a market around the solution, the attenuation of the patient's relationship to her own experience as the pharmaceutical frame becomes the primary frame through which the experience is interpreted. The women who took Dexedrine in the 1950s were not wrong to trust their doctors. They were not wrong to accept the prescriptions offered to them. They were operating in an information environment that had been constructed to produce trust and to supply prescriptions, and they were doing what reasonable people do in the information environments available to them. The women who use sunscreen daily and have low vitamin D are not wrong to follow the dermatologist's advice. They are not wrong to take the supplement the internist recommends. They are doing what reasonable people do with the information they have. The question that the history asks, the question that the women who sat in those interviews with researchers in their 70s were asking in their own way, is not what should I have done differently. It is what should I know that I have not been told. And the follow-up to that question, which is harder and more useful, what am I currently not being told, and how do I find it? The finding is now more possible than it was. This is one of the genuine changes. The information is more accessible. The patient advocacy networks are more robust. The culture of informed consent has advanced. The expectation that patients are active participants in their healthcare rather than passive recipients of expert decisions has taken root in ways that make the information environment less managed than it was in 1958. The information environment is still managed. It is managed by market interests, by specialty training that creates frames as well as expertise, by the political economy of research funding, by the social dynamics of the doctor-patient relationship that still, in most cases, positions the doctor as the authority and the patient as the receiver of authority. The management is less total than it was. It is more transparent. The seams are more visible. Seeing the seams is useful. It is not a reason for cynicism, which is its own kind of frame, its own way of not looking carefully. It is a reason for the particular kind of attention that takes the expert's knowledge seriously without taking the expert's frame for granted, that asks what the evidence shows and also asks what frame is organizing the evidence, and whether the frame is adequate to the full complexity of the situation. This kind of attention is demanding. It requires time and education, and a tolerance for uncertainty that is not always comfortable. It is not available equally to everyone. It requires the resources of time and education and access that are not equally distributed. The patient who has 30 minutes to research her prescription, and the patient who has none, are in different situations, even if they sit in the same waiting room chair. The equity of attention is its own issue, and it is one that the pharmaceutical industry and the healthcare system have not consistently prioritized. The simplified message, the single recommendation, the broad guideline. These are forms of efficiency that serve the system and sometimes serve the patient and sometimes do not serve the patient, and rarely serve the patient who is most unlike the average patient the guideline was designed for. The history is good for this, at least. The history makes visible over time what was invisible in the moment. The 12-week trial that did not show what 6 months would have shown. The safety signal that was in the data before it was in the warning. The trade-off that was present from the beginning but not in the materials the detail man brought to the doctor's office. Looking at the history with enough time and enough care, you can see the shape of the current moment more clearly than the current moment sees itself. You can see where the 12-week trials are. You can see where the detail man has been. You can see where the trade-off is being backgrounded. You cannot see everything. The future is still opaque. The GLP-1 story does not have an ending yet. The sunscreen vitamin D synthesis is still being done. The science is still moving. There will be findings that are not yet available, connections not yet made, consequences not yet visible. The history cannot tell you the ending. What it can tell you is the pattern, and the pattern is enough to ask better questions. To ask, what is the 12-week trial not showing? To ask, what is the detail man not saying? To ask, what is the trade-off that is being called a side effect rather than a systemic consequence? And then to wait, with the patience of someone who has been sitting in a waiting room long enough to know that the news will come, and to have some sense, from the history, of what shape the news is likely to take. The room is still. The chair is comfortable enough. The magazines on the table are new. The evening light has changed. It has been changing for the last hour, the way evening light does, moving through its spectrum from the blue clarity of late afternoon toward the amber warmth of the hour before the sun disappears. This shift in light quality is not cosmetic. The body is reading it, the way the body reads all the light signals available to it, translating the spectral information into hormonal instruction. The melatonin that has been suppressed by the blue light of the day is beginning to rise. The cortisol of the active day is beginning to fall. The body is preparing. Preparation for sleep is something the body has been practicing for a long time. The practice is so old and so refined that it operates mostly below the level of consciousness, in the hormonal and neurological systems that do not require direction, that simply move through their patterns in response to the environmental cues they were designed to read. The light changing, the temperature dropping, the cessation of the day's physical activity, the signals accumulate and the body responds. In a room somewhere, a woman has turned off most of the lights. She's in the amber light of the one lamp she's left on, and the lamp is warm and its light does not have the blue component that suppresses melatonin, and so the melatonin continues to rise and the body continues to settle, and the readiness for sleep accumulates in the way that good readiness accumulates, gradually, naturally, without forcing. She has been listening to a story. The story has been long, and it has covered a great deal of territory, and it has done the thing that long stories do when they are moving well. It has placed her inside a world that is not her own world, but that is recognizable enough to feel inhabited, familiar enough in its texture of waiting rooms and kitchen counters, and amber bottles and morning light to carry her through the history, without the history becoming abstract. The history has not been alarming. This was important. The history is, in its details, alarming. 8 million women taking amphetamines their doctors prescribed, not knowing what they were taking or what it would mean to stop. The population-level shift in vitamin D status that happened quietly under the cover of good public health advice. The cycle of pharmaceutical promises and pharmaceutical consequences that has repeated itself across the decades with the patience of something that does not need to hurry because the market will always be there. But the alarming is not the point of a story told at the edge of sleep. The point is understanding, which is different from alarm. Understanding does not produce the adrenaline spike that alarm produces, does not narrow the attention to the single threatened object, does not wire the body for action when the body is trying to prepare for rest. Understanding produces something more like the long exhalation of someone who has been holding a question for a while, and has now not answered it exactly, but become more comfortable with its shape. The shape of the question is something like this. What do I not know about what I have been told? And what would I need to know to make better decisions about my own body and my own health? It is not a question that resolves tonight. It is a question that will be with her in the morning, when she reads the label on the sunscreen bottle, or looks at the vitamin D supplement on the shelf, or thinks about the prescription she is considering, or the one she has been taking for 3 years. The question does not need to resolve tonight. It just needs to be present. It just needs to be held, with the quality of attention that holds something gently rather than gripping it, the kind of attention that allows for the possibility of a different answer at a different time as the evidence changes and the science advances and the history continues to accumulate. The room is quieter now. The street sounds outside have diminished. Whatever traffic the neighbourhood produces has settled into its nighttime minimum. The occasional car, the distant dog, the ambient hum of electricity in the walls. These sounds are not disruptive. They are the sounds of the world continuing to be the world, and continuing is, in its way, reassuring. The body is very close to sleep. The thoughts are loosening from their narrative structure, becoming less sequential, more associative. A kitchen in 1960, the scratch of a pen, the colour of an amber bottle held up against the light, a woman in a waiting room reading a magazine whose cover shows another woman smiling the smile of someone who has been told she's doing everything correctly. The woman in the magazine has been many women. She has changed her haircut and her dress and the products advertised beside her, but she's been in the waiting room through the whole of this history, smiling her particular smile, being held up as the evidence of what is possible if the prescription is taken and the advice followed and the standard met. The standard is always just out of reach. This is part of how markets work. The standard that is perfectly met does not produce another prescription, does not produce a return visit, does not produce the next product cycle. The standard that is achievable with effort and pharmaceutical assistance, but that requires ongoing effort and ongoing assistance. This standard is the engine of the market for body management, and it has been running since the late 1940s, and it is running now, and it will be running in some form for as long as there are bodies and markets, and the particular human desire to be better than one currently is. Knowing this does not make the desire go away. Knowing that the standard is constructed does not make the body's experience of not meeting it less real. The woman who feels better on the prescription is genuinely feeling better. The woman who has more energy, more productivity, more of the quality she values in herself when she's managing the day well. She is not imagining this. The pharmaceutical is doing something real. The question is whether the something real is the full story, and history suggests that it very rarely is. The full story takes longer to tell than 12 weeks. It takes longer than a detail man's visit. It takes longer than the 11-minute consultation. It takes years, sometimes, for the full story to become visible. The consequences that only appear at 6 months. The trade-offs that only become clear at 3 years. The long-term effects on systems that the short-term trials were not measuring. The historian who comes later can see the full story. The patient who is inside it cannot. This asymmetry is one of the permanent conditions of living in time. The understanding comes after. The decision must come before. The best available substitute for foreknowledge is pattern recognition. The recognition, from the history, of the shapes that pharmaceutical promises tend to take. The shapes that the complications tend to take when they arrive. The shapes of the information management that produces the gap between what the patient is told and what the patient would benefit from knowing. The pattern recognition that comes from the history does not require the patient to be a historian. It requires only the kind of attention that is willing to ask, before accepting the prescription, what the 12-week trial did not show, and who funded the trial, and what the long-term follow-up data says, and what discontinuation looks like, and whether the problem the prescription is solving is the problem, or a symptom of another problem that the prescription will address but not resolve. These questions can be asked gently. They do not require confrontation. They require the confidence that the questions are legitimate, that the patient's interest in the full story is appropriate, that the 11 minutes is not the only opportunity available, and that if the 11 minutes is inadequate to the complexity, the patient is entitled to more. The room is very quiet now. The lamp is on. The body is in the long approach to sleep, the warm coasting toward the thing that the body has been building toward all evening. The thoughts are growing slower. The associations are becoming more dreamlike, less tethered to the sequence of the story, and more available to the images the story has left. An amber bottle in the afternoon light, the sound of a receptionist's pen, a woman standing at a kitchen window with coffee going cold, the particular silence of a neighbourhood that has settled into the night. Let the story settle. Let it find its level, which is the level of the things you carry without carrying them deliberately, the things you know without announcing you know them, the understanding that lives in the body rather than the mind and that does the work it does quietly, over time, in the decisions made and the questions asked and the particular quality of attention brought to the next waiting room, the next prescription, the next amber bottle on the counter. The body is settling, the melatonin is high, the cortisol is low, the room is dark except for the one lamp, and the lamp will go out now, and the darkness will be the comfortable darkness of a room known well enough to move through without light. Sleep is close, let it come. Let the history rest. Let the morning be when it comes, the morning after understanding, not the morning after alarm, not the morning of new urgency, but the morning that wakes with a slightly clearer sense of the shape of the thing, of the question worth carrying, of the particular and ordinary courage that living in a body requires. The lamp is off, the room is dark, the street outside is quiet. Good night. Come back to the waiting room. The floor wax smell, the faded green walls, the magazines on the low table, the covers showing women who are smiling the smile of someone who has recently been told they are doing everything correctly. The silk flowers by the door need dusting. The receptionist behind the frosted glass is writing something down. The scratch of her pen is the only sound that moves through the room with any purpose. The amber bottle is on the counter. It is very small. It fits easily in a hand. The waiting room holds all of the waiting that has happened in it. This one and the ones before it and the ones that have replaced it. The waiting in 1958 and the waiting in 1967, and the waiting in 1972 when the prescriptions were getting harder to fill, and the waiting in 1997 when the Fen-Phen news was just beginning to reach the doctor's offices, and the waiting in 2010 when Meridia was withdrawn, and the waiting now in a room that looks more or less like this one but with better chairs and a different kind of light fixture, and a front desk that uses a computer rather than a paper ledger. The waiting has the same quality across all of these rooms, which is the quality of a question held in the body before it is spoken. The question is something about what this is, and whether it will help, and what it will cost in ways the price tag does not indicate. The question is sometimes spoken and sometimes not. The answer, when it comes, is never quite complete. And yet the women come back. They come back because they need something. Information, care, the legitimization of a concern, the tool the culture has said will help with the gap between the body they have and the body the world has decided they should have. They come back because the alternative to coming is managing without, and managing without is also a choice with consequences, and the consequences are sometimes worse. The ambivalence is not a failure of judgment. The ambivalence is appropriate, the situation warrants it. What the narrator knows, having been in this room for the full length of this story, is that the ambivalence can be held while also holding something else. A quality of attention, a willingness to ask the next question, a recognition that the prescription and the advice and the guideline are beginning places rather than ending places in the conversation about the body. The body's not a problem. This is worth saying as the story closes. The body is not a problem to be solved by the right pharmaceutical at the right dose. It is a system that has been developing its methods for a very long time, and those methods are mostly adequate. And where they are not adequate, the pharmaceutical tools available in this extraordinary century of medicine have genuine and real assistance to offer. The assistance is not the story. The story is the body, and the pharmaceutical is a tool inside the story. And like all tools, it is most useful when the person using it understands what it is for and what it is not for, and what using it will cost. Understanding what it is for and what it is not for requires information that is not always easy to come by, and that requires the effort to seek it. The effort is worth it. The history suggests it is worth it. The history of what happened when the effort was not made, when the prescription was accepted and the box was not looked into, is the history this story has been spending the last several hours exploring. The effort is ordinary. It does not require expertise or defiance or any particular courage. It requires the willingness to ask one more question at the end of the 11 minutes, or to go looking for the answer that the 11 minutes could not contain. It requires the recognition that the women in this story were ordinary women doing ordinary things, and that the history happened to them not because they were exceptional in their naivety or their trust, but because they were ordinary people in an information environment that was managing their access to information, and that being in a less managed information environment requires only the recognition that the management exists. The recognition is enough. The rest follows from it imperfectly over time, in the way that most good things follow, not dramatically, not all at once, but in the accumulated small decisions of someone who is paying attention. The woman on the vinyl chair is reading one of the magazines, or she's looking at the wall above the magazine rack, or she's thinking about something she's not yet found words for. She's come in with a concern. The concern has been given a name by the culture she lives in, a medical name, a name that makes the concern legitimate, treatable, amenable to the tools the doctor has available. She's about to walk through the door and receive something that she will carry home and that will become part of the machinery of her days. This is not a story about her bad judgment. She's not a cautionary tale. She's a person in a system, and the system is giving her what the system gives, and what the system gives is shaped by things she's not been asked to examine and has not been given adequate tools to examine. She's doing her best with what she has been told. The narrator is not angry about this. She is not alarmed. She's known this story long enough. This story and the one before it and the one that will come after it, the turning of the wheel through the decades, that she has reached a place beyond alarm, a place that is something like understanding, which is not the same as acceptance of the system, but it is the clarity that comes from having looked at the thing all the way through. What endures from an era that mostly preferred not to be looked at too closely is the particular courage of the women who noticed something and kept noticing, even when they did not have the language for what they were noticing, who felt the shape of the thing in the dark and knew it was there even without being able to name it, who talked to each other in the circumferential way of people who are finding their way toward a word, who were, slowly and without ceremony, building a vocabulary. That vocabulary exists now. It is better than it was. It is still not complete. The wheel is still turning. The woman in the waiting room puts down her magazine. She straightens her skirt. The receptionist calls her name. She stands. The afternoon light through the window is the particular amber of late afternoon, the same light that falls through every window in this story, in every decade, the light that does not choose sides or carry opinions, that falls with equal patience on the prescription pad and the amber bottle, and the face of the woman who is about to open the inner door. She opens it. She walks through. Let the door close softly behind her. Let the room be quiet. Let the afternoon settle. Let the things you have heard tonight sit with you in the way that stories sit, not as alarms or urgencies, but as understanding, slow forming, the kind that becomes useful over time rather than immediately. The waiting room grows still. The silk flowers by the door don't move. The magazines stay on the table. The amber bottle catches the light. Sleep now. You've been listening carefully, and listening is its own kind of work, and you deserve rest. The story is complete, or as complete as this kind of story gets, which is to say, it is complete up to now, and the rest is still being written, in waiting rooms that look a little different from this one, but smell, still, of something floral from a small bottle by the door. Thank you so much for watching. If you'd like to see more videos like this, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel. It really helps us keep making more content. See you in the next one. And one last thing. If any of this resonated with you, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. Were there women in your family who lived through the Dexedrine era? Does the cycle of weight loss solutions, decade after decade, new drug, same promise, remind you of anything in your own experience? I'm always curious what this kind of history stirs up for people who hear it.